Lermy, thanks so much for doing this. I appreciate it. Can you give me a little introduction about yourself? Describe what you do for Hi-Rez and what kind of development you do for Smite.
Yeah, so my name is LermyWermy. I am a game designer at Hi-Rez, of course, on Smite. And a lot of what I do is revolving around balance, characters, gods, items, even a little bit of map stuff from time to time. I also kind of dabble in doing some other things, like you'll see me on patch notes, or I'll be on various content pieces. Sometimes I make some of those content pieces, which is really cool. And then I also write voice packs as well. So that's another fun, like, kind of uninvolved aspect of my job that people don't see too much, but they hear it, which is the cool part.
Yeah, definitely. And I actually do want to get into the voice pack writing a little bit later because that sounds really cool.
Cool, yeah.
How many characters have you had a direct hand in creating? And can you name like a few of them?
Yeah, I guess it depends like what you would call like direct hand, but when it comes to the ones that I've led the design for, there's been 5. There's been Yu Huang, Ishtar, Martichoras, Charon, and Newt were the 5 that I have led so far. I'm very excited to see what more of those will look like in Smite 2. But at this point, that's what I've done, and hopefully there's more to come. But when it comes to just in general, I started working at Hi-Rez in September of 2020. And so the first god that I ever got to see playtested was Danzaburrow, and he was using a temporary Cupid model, which was really fun. He was a little Cupid. So from that point onward, I guess you could say I had a hand in it a bit because I got to test it. I got to give feedback on the gods as they were coming out. So that's like, I guess what you would consider like a base level of like, I have contributed to this god. But yeah, the lead has been 5 so far.
So wait, you mentioned her name is Newt and that's Nut, or is that
Yeah,
like her name
yeah.
is spelled Nut? Okay.
It's spelled nut. Yeah.
Okay. I don't think I've heard it called Newt, but that's interesting. I'll start calling her that. Newt. Okay, so kind of going into some of these characters, say for example Ishtar,
Mhm.
what is the process in creating a character for Smite? Ishtar, for example, say from like
Yeah.
initial concept all the way to delivery, what's that
Oh
process
man.
like?
Okay, so it's a long process. It takes about 9 to 10 months for like the average god. There are some gods that take longer. A good example of that would be like Shiva, who took probably close to a year, maybe longer than a year, just because they wanted to be really culturally sensitive to basically everything going on with the Hindu pantheon. So that was like one of the ones that took longer. But if we're talking like more normal characters like Ishtar, she took about 9 months. I think the first meeting that I ever had on her was in like November, and then she released the next following year in August. So that was a very long process. But the first thing that kind of happened in that process was that we were filling out the god roster of the year. We were like, okay, we need to do a hunter at some point. What could this hunter be? What kind of fits the themes of the year? What have we not had for a while? What are, characters that the community just finds really cool and really exciting? Um, and so Ishtar kind of found that spot. So what comes after we decide what the character is a lot of research. And that comes from mostly me. I'm the one that's doing a lot of the like character research, like what is this, character about? What do they do in the lore? What is their mythology? What is their relation to other gods? And Ishtar actually was a really unique one because she was from a smaller pantheon, still kind of within Smite. So her relations to other gods is kind of minimal in a sense, but it's also a cool thing because she was actually the inspiration for a lot of later gods and later religions. So it was interesting to kind of tie into a little bit of that when it comes to the research. So I would say, she had some Aphrodite kind of inspirations and even a little bit, towards the Bellona end of things with like the goddess of war. But she was a bit of the combined aspect of it, right? So I had to sit there and explain to my coworkers essentially like what this god does. That was really fun for Newt, by the way. Her lore is very crazy, and I still can't believe that I had to say some of that to my coworkers with a straight face. But that's mythology for you, I guess. But yeah, essentially, I have to explain to the team what this character is, and then they come back to me and they say, "Okay, here's some ideas that we have. Whether that's the actual concept, what does this god look like?" Sometimes I have to say, in mythology, this character, Newt, for example, is often portrayed with blue skin, so we should probably have her have blue skin. That's probably like a must-have. I kind of give them the list of like we need to have these things in the design, but then go crazy, do whatever you want, and just bring us, the next step. After that, though, we kind of have brainstorms, I guess you could say, with every department. We kind of do them separated by department because a lot of them, take their own department's concerns into account when they start to like give ideas. Like, for instance, if I go to FX, they'll say, oh, it'd be really cool if Newt had like these star projectiles, or like Ishtar did this lightning thing, and that's really awesome. And then maybe animation has a different opinion. They go, well, Ishtar is a goddess of war, so she could do like this really agile stuff, or like backflips, or like do really cool things with weapons. So it's all about like piecing together those different details of like what the different departments want. And the most fun ones in my mind, not to say that any of them are bad, but there are some that are a little more, they get a little more chaotic than others. I love brainstorming with esports, and I love brainstorming with design, just the various designers outside of like the gameplay sphere, because they have some wild ideas. The esports ones have been really, really unhinged, which I think is really fun, because even though they come in and they spew, sometimes it can be a little bit of, just yapping through that time. It's always fun to like get down to the core of like what they want, because they have a really good eye for what's exciting and what's really cool to look at, especially like for a wider audience and a wider view. So they have really good ideas. But we've done the ideation phase. We've gone through, what do people think that she should do? Now it comes back to me, and I have to decide, okay, what do they actually do? What are my ideas for this character's kit? Like, let's actually put those building blocks together. At that point, it gets a little bit more serious. It's like, okay, we're actually like starting to put stuff on paper. Like, this is what this character is going to do. So I will tend to make 3 different kits, essentially. And they're usually kind of baseline paper ideas, where it comes down to, here's 1 idea, here's 2 ideas, here's 3 ideas. And then I'll present them to the designers and say, hey guys, what do you like? What do you not like? Do you like this kit's idea? Do you like this one? And usually they'll be separated by themes. Like, usually there'll be one that's more focused on one theme. Like, I'm trying to think, like for Charon, there was one that was really water focused. There was one that was really gold focused. And then there was one that was like really soul focused, I guess. And we ended up like taking pieces of all of that for Charon, which I thought was really cool. Sometimes it'll work like that, where we'll take like this ability from this kit and this ability from that kit. But sometimes the kit will go in like wholesale, which actually, funnily enough, I did not work directly on Tiamat, but that's actually kind of what happened with Tiamat, is she had a wholesale kit go in, and that was like it, which was super crazy considering just how many abilities Tiamat has. Like, if I were to pull up the like original like kit pitch, it's literally all there, which is super, super cool that like there's a variety and like what ends up going into the final for those gods. But then after that point, we're like, oh snap, like the work's actually beginning. We have to actually like push this into production. So we got to break down, all of the different various things this character does. Say, hey, programming, can you make all of this stuff for us? Does this work? Can we even like put this in the game? And they go, yeah, cool, awesome, amazing. I go to FX. Can we do all of these things? Animation, this, and start to get into that more like serious phase. After that, though, we start to get an actual character, which is really fun. And then I have to come back in and start to actually like set up the pieces. They'll say, okay, here's this part for this ability in this like document form when it comes to putting it into our database. And then I have to set up like their base damage and all of the effects in their kit, if they have stuns, if they have silences, those kind of things. That comes back to me. And then usually our art will take just a little bit longer after that. Because there tends to be some iteration on those artistic processes. So I'll actually have to make temporary art to go in, which is fun in its own way, because I know basically nothing about making some of this art. I will just essentially steal bits and pieces from other characters' kits and then put it into like the base character, so that at least they have something so we can start playtesting them. And then slowly they get replaced, because obviously I'm not an artist, so that will just get cleared away at that point. But yeah, then we're testing, which is like, yeah, we're basically almost there. We just have to make sure the character feels good. Usually, the character will change, quite a bit between the paper design and the like tested design. I'm trying to think who was closest out of all the characters that I worked on. Honestly, oh god, I don't think any of them were close. I think the one that changed the least was probably Ishtar. But even then, she still changed a lot from paper design to final design, which I think is really cool. And it can be a little bit stressful, because by the time we get to playtesting, we have about 1 to 2 months left of our like cycle, of our development cycle, because a lot of that early stuff is like planning and like runway for the art teams to do their thing. Because at that point, we're working on other stuff, other content. But yeah, I'm like, oh snap, we like actually have to like make these changes because we want this character to feel good. But it's always awesome seeing everyone come together and start to make these changes for these characters because like it really starts to come to fruition. Like there's some changes that we've made that have been like, yep, like that's it. That's the right thing to do. We've made the character so much better. Doing that change, but it's all about allocating those resources and making sure that that stuff works. But yeah, playtesting is like kind of the last big phase, and then they're out there, which is crazy. It's still crazy to me that's like a thing that I get to do because I started playing Smite in 2014. It's almost been 10 years exactly at this point for me. I was in high school, and now I get to make the characters, which is like, what the heck, man? Like that's crazy.
Yeah, that's mind blowing. Something that you would never really like think about back when you were in high school. That you get to
Yeah.
make the actual characters for the game itself. You know, that the game that you love playing.
Yeah, it's insane. Like I don't know how I got here, honestly. But I'm thankful every day to be able to do this job because it's just so cool.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm actually kind of curious now. Was Tiamat's initial design? I know you didn't work directly on Tiamat, but for Tiamat's initial design, was she a stance switcher?
Yes, she was a stance switcher.
Okay, okay. And so like when you talk about having 3 sets of kits for like each character or
Mhm.
3 sets of kit designs, for Tiamat was it like 6? Because she's a
Uh,
stance switcher.
I guess kind of. I'm trying to remember. I think Tiamat had like 2 standard kits, and usually what we'll do is we'll have like, well, I guess for me I like to do this. I know Aggro likes to do this as well, where we like play it pretty by the books for like our first 2 kits. We're like, yeah, this is really standard, you know. God, here you go. They have 4 abilities. That's awesome. There's always one kit that we get a little bit unhinged with that we're like, what if they had 8 abilities? What if they had 6 abilities? What if, you know, going a little bit more maybe on theme, but pushing the scope a little bit. And that's kind of the thing that we have to fight with is like how much scope can we actually use to make these things versus, you know, how much return on investment is it going to give us if we actually do like 6, 7, 8 abilities, things like that.
Yeah, definitely like kind of like balancing between having a lot of fun with the characters design and actual like
Yeah.
reality of can we really do this?
Yeah. Because sometimes you can actually pull really good ideas from doing those like super like unhinged things because it's really like, to me at least, those kits are all about like letting the passion and the creativity flow more so than like trying to put yourself in a box. Because the way that I've kind of explained design, or like actually working on design, is trying to play within the box of like, we have this many resources, what is the absolute most that we can do within our box. But sometimes you can take stuff that goes outside the box, you know, we're not staying within here, and push it back into the box. So I think a lot of the like passion really comes from those times when I can stay outside the lines and then bring it a little bit back in.
And you mentioned so most characters take 8 to 9 months to develop.
Mhm.
How many characters in that time are you like working on? Because you're probably not working on just one or two, are you?
Usually, at least in the process that it's been for Smite 1, it's going to change a lot for Smite 2. It's been between 1 to 2 for an individual
Okay.
designer, but at any given time, there were like 3 characters in various points of production. Usually, we would do like kind of a cycle of different designers working on them, or it'd be back and forth between me and Aggro. And as I'm sure that you know, that was kind of the process even previously, when it would be like even back to the times of like Fishman gods or AJ gods or things like that. So I do really appreciate that cycle because it is really difficult to do back-to-back gods. I know, like for instance, Pon did Set and Horus, and they came out at the same time, and that was like a crazy experience for Pon. He talks about just like how much work that is, because even working on one god, having your focus on one god is like a full days of work. So I can't even imagine like what that would have been for him. So I'm just like, thank goodness, like I have my space to do my thing. But usually what will happen is towards like the playtesting phase, the beginning of the playtesting phase, production will come to us and be like, hey, next god's gotta get rolling. And I'm like, okay, cool, I can do research while I'm playtesting. Because they're like, I'd say like the biggest like brunt of the work is actually coming up with the kits, but doing the research, that's fun. I get to read books, I get to read articles, like I get to watch YouTube videos. That's sick. I don't mind doing that part, and I don't mind showing up to a playtest every day, giving them a try, doing some balance. Balance is like a very normal thing that I do. So that just feels like, you know, a drop of water in the bucket when it comes to the rest of the work. So at that point I'm like chill. But if you were to tell me that I had to work on like 2 kits at the same time, I think my brain would explode.
Yeah, it makes sense if you have to devise like 6, 7, 8 different kits at once. You know,
Yeah.
two for each, two 2 sets for each character. What's like the funnest part of the development stage for you? Like the funnest process? Is it playtesting or is it researching?
Oh god, it's hard to say. I really like the research. I'm not gonna lie to
Mhm.
you. I think the research is really, really fun and interesting, but it's not like unique, I think. So it gets a couple like minus points for that because it could be like I could do that at any job basically. But I do think the really unique and fun part about my job that I love the most is actually going in and like starting to see the character come together. Like when I was talking about doing the temporary art assets, that's usually the time where like programming has put things together and then I'm like making it visible. Like for instance, let's just take like a random ability. Like let's say Scylla Crush. Like Scylla can do her crush, but she's not actually like hitting, like showing that she's hitting things if she doesn't have like the big circle on the ground. I mean, there's so many pieces to these abilities that you wouldn't even think exist, but they do. So being able to actually pull things together to like make them visible and start to see things come together and feel them out is like really, really magical for me to like see that came from here, like, and now it's there. Like I can't believe that's a thing that's happening right now. And usually there's a lot of you know, back and forth that comes with that, like, hey programming, I don't love how this feels, can we work on this amount, or hey, you know, FX or audio, we need a bit more clarity here. But just watching those pieces come together is just like such a like, ooh, it's so fulfilling, dude. I love it. It's like it really makes the character feel like it's coming alive when it's been like, at that point it's been in production for like 4 months. So it's like you spent all this time, all this energy coming up with these things, and now it's real, and it's like that's it's so crazy. I don't know how they do it. They're geniuses, and you know, the things that I write they just magically do, which I find is so incredible.
Yeah, I took a game programming course because I'm doing computer science, and it was by far the funnest course I've taken. And like just being able to, our final project was creating like a mini game with a couple other people, and just being able to write some code and like design a couple things, like minor things, and like just see all that interact on a screen. I mean, it's like magic. It's almost like
Yeah.
magic. That's what it is.
Yeah. It blows my mind that so many games get made. I'm not gonna lie to you, because like there's so many pieces that go
Yeah.
into it. And at any point, if those pieces aren't working perfectly together, things just don't feel right. So just to actually be behind those scenes and be the like kind of the glue, I guess, that keeps it all together. Because to me, and like maybe this is like a little bit of like imposter syndrome type stuff, but like I'm like, oh my god, like all these guys are doing such amazing things, and literally all I'm doing is putting it in the thing. Sometimes that's how it feels, but like at the end of the day, I know that like it is a lot of project management, the stuff that I do, and just making sure that everyone's on the same page, and that stuff is really valuable to them as well. Just to feel like, you know, everyone's united on the same page, and doing the things that they, you know, need to be doing in the most efficient time possible. And just having really good directions, it turns out, is really helpful to people. From Yu Huang to working on Newt, I have looked back at some of the old Jiras and various other like directions I've given, and I've been like, I would not have understood what I wrote there. I'm sure they appreciate so much more the amount of detail that I go into now versus you know, the first character that I worked on. And it's always nice to have that like appreciation coming back from them, that they're like, dude, this was really, really simple, really, really easy, awesome. And I go, yeah, man. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I wrote that note really well. Yeah, sick.
Yeah, it's like a puzzle, it's
Mhm.
every single piece has to fit. You miss one piece and the puzzle looks completely off.
Yeah.
And so that's what it is. Like everybody's job is very important, no matter like if it feels like it's not important or if it feels like it's overly important. Everybody's job is a piece of the puzzle that makes the puzzle work.
Yeah, it definitely can be like that for sure. Like I think when you look at it in like the micro scale, it like doesn't feel like a lot, but the macro scale is really where things start to come together and you can see the full picture. And it's just a really, like I keep saying it, but like magical process that all of this comes together and it works and it feels good and it's just so much fun.
What would you say is like the hardest part or hardest stage of character development?
Um, Honestly, it's probably the stage where like things are in progress. Like for instance, we'll do playtests where animations aren't done. You know, they're not finalized. They don't have secondaries where like all of their clothes or hair or like other things are animated. You know, FX doesn't have like friendly enemy in, so they look the same to everybody, or things of that nature, where like sounds are still temp and like other things are final. A lot of that feedback that I'll get from those tests is like, I can't hear this, I can't see this, and I'm like, I know it's not done yet. We understand that, and that's probably the hardest part, because you're trying to rationalize in your head, like, is something actually wrong with this character? Or are we just waiting for the final stuff to come in where everything starts to click together into place? The problem is you have to work against the clock at that point, where, you're saying, okay, we have 2 weeks left on this character, and they're still saying that. Is there an actual problem that we can address in this time? Or are we just like, do we need to wait for the final stuff to come in? Like, that like assessment, I think, is probably the hardest part of the whole development. Besides coming up with the kit, that one's also hard. But like when it comes to like me having to make those judgment calls, I have definitely gone to a lot of my seniors and been like, hey guys, what are your thoughts on this? Like, should I ask XYZ department for more support on this? Do you think this is an actual problem, or is it going to get fixed? In the natural process. So it's very hard to make those judgment calls sometimes, and there are times where we have to make compromises just due to time constraints and other kind of resource constraints. But most of the time, the team wants to make the best product possible no matter what. So they are my absolute goats in terms of like, if I ask them for something, it's always, how can we do this? Like what's the process that we need to do? What can we squeeze in? Not like, no, we can't do this. It's never a no, which I think is the most amazing part of my team, is they just want to make really cool stuff. And they will do whatever it takes to make it happen.
Yeah, how many people are involved in your team?
I guess when it comes to a single god development, it's hard to like put an exact number on, because some departments work on it differently. Like for instance, animation is the entire department works on every single thing that they touch. They each put their own like animation into it. Like for instance, they'll split up, like, you're doing the combat animations, you're doing the ability animations, you're doing the wave clap taunt type thing. So like that's everybody. Whereas FX is usually like one person, design is usually one person is like in charge of it, but like everybody kind of contributes to playtesting a little bit and giving balanced feedback on them. And they all contribute as well to the design and the kit in the process I described earlier. I'm trying to think of other good examples. Like there is another department called tech art that is usually one person is like the point. That's typically how it tends to be. Is I think like most departments other than animation, there's like a point person, but everyone kind of works on it a little bit. So yeah, I think animation's pretty unique in that. I'm trying to think if there's any other department that works similarly to that, but not really. Usually it's maybe like 10 different departments will work together in terms of making any character, like if you're counting like marketing as well, and the people that will do kind of the audio engineering on that as well. There's just so many different pieces of the puzzle, like we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a lot of people. It's cool because it gives me like a really good take on how long it actually takes to develop a character and all the resources that you actually put into it. It really gives me a newfound appreciation almost for it. Whenever you kind of go and play a character like Ishtar, for example, it's like, wow, this took 8 to 9 months, to create. It took all this research, all this development.
Yeah.
It's absolutely amazing. So how do you approach, for the design for the ability design for some of the characters that you do, say for example, Ishtar, how do you approach designing those abilities? Are they like lore heavy, or are there like, well, and we'll get to balancing later, but like, are they mostly like lore heavy, or like how exactly is that approached? Like when you're creating the different kits?
It's different for every character. I think a lot of the times we go into it kind of knowing what their class not should be, but like approximately what we want them to play like. Like, do we want them to be tanky? If they're a hunter, I mean, they're pretty obviously like in the kind of basic attack focus to some extent. So we go, okay, what do ADCs like normally have? They normally have like a movement, they have a clear, they have a stim. That's typically like your very, very average base level. Like, this is what I should be kind of aiming for. If I want to divert from that, I can. And then that's where like the lore and just general like cool new inspiration stuff comes in. I think for Ishtar, we were really focused on like the weapon and like war aspect of her like lore. Because she's a goddess of war, right? So she wants to kind of be proficient with all kinds of weapons. She was portrayed with, several different kinds of them. So we're like, how do we represent this without actually giving her a million different weapons, because that would just be out of scope. That's like the part where I'm like out of the box and I'm like, okay, we got to bring it back in the box a little bit.
Yeah.
We're like, well, what if she just has a million different basic attack types? And then we go, what if she does this kind of basic or that kind of basic? And then we're like, hold on, stop. How do we actually put that into an ability? Like, how does she switch between them? Like, what does that look like? What does that feel like? And that's kind of where we start to break down the more like technical side of things, where it comes from like, here's her lore, her nebulous lore. Let's like put it into the box now. And that part is really fun to me, to like kind of do like the problem solving of like, how do I take this theme that's kind of generic and like fill it into the clear or the stim or the movement or whatever big thing needs to happen for the ultimate. And the ultimates are honestly really fun, because they kind of tend to be like, what is the biggest, coolest, most amazing, visually stunning thing this character can do in all of their lore? And then we kind of, sometimes it's a little bit more like open-ended. I think for one of Ishtar's ultimate pitches that I had, this I can kind of talk about because like it's a little bit complicated. It was kind of like a half-baked idea at that point, but I was like, what if her ultimate was like a stim alt like set? And then they immediately went, no, you said set, stop. And I was like, okay, why are you saying stop? And they're like, well, stim ultimates are really cool, they can be fun, but you really have to invest a lot into their design because yada yada yada. They're typically just a lot harder to pull off, and so what will happen is like you'll need to go into all these extra steps to fill it out, and sometimes we do those steps, but sometimes there are other ideas that already exist in the kit that were like, actually that could be really cool, like jazzed up as an ultimate. Like her ultimate was going to be a regular ability, and they were like, well, what if we just made that her ultimate? Like that's
Really?
super sick already. Yeah. So I think that was, I want to say her 2 in one of the kits that I made for her, and then she eventually got it moved up into an ultimate because we were just like, that could be presentation wise like really pushed to the limit, and we think it could look really cool for her to fire out the swords that she does. And again, it goes back to that weapon aspect of her lore, and it was like, okay, we can tie in all these threads here, and like the stim alt's cool and all, but it has a lot more challenges to make it like just feel really impactful without having to go into those extra other concerns. And it's not to say like stim ultimates are bad. Again, like Set has such a cool ultimate, which was the example that I used, but it is just like kind of a more difficult avenue to take. And again, that's not to say that they're bad avenues, but it's just how much are we willing to actually try to put it into, or try to cram stuff into the box versus like, okay, we can be a little bit more realistic here with what we can do and what will work the best. Sometimes people will say, I really want to push the limits, and that's totally cool, and I love seeing that. Like Klina is a really good example of like something that feels really simple but really pushes the limits, right? You know what I mean? Like no other character had to go into walls before, deal with walls in the same way. Like there are ways to make those kind of ideas be really feasible without breaking the team essentially. So it's all about like figuring out like which pieces of that like lore and general kit like shape that you need to be able to like form into this like base that's going to work for everybody. It's a lot of discussion, it's a lot of debate sometimes of like, I think this could be really cool, and then again the kit changes so much during playtesting as well that sometimes your paper design is just not the same as it was originally, which I think the biggest thing that changed for Ishtar is probably her 2. I think out of everything, because her 2 was a bit smaller, I think, and it had a bunch of different shapes. It did different effects than it did at the final iteration of it. So I think like going back and looking at it, like she was actually pretty close. She was probably the closest out of all of the characters to like her initial like one kit pitch. But even just comparing them, like so much changed, and a lot of the inspiration for her came from her lore, but also what would feel and look really cool, what would make like the individual themselves feel really empowered, because that's also really important. Like it's a third person game, you want to kind of feel the bond with the character that you're playing and feel like you are, I'm gonna use this like phrasing, but like you kind of know what I mean. Doesn't mean like better than everybody else, like more powerful, like I'm stronger, like the stuff that I'm doing is way cooler than what you're doing. And trying to find like that niche for like every character that I make is really, really cool, to kind of be the person that's like living the, I guess, like power fantasy, you know what I mean? Of like, I'm a god. Like, how do I make this person feel like I'm a god? which is maybe a little bit of like a silly way to phrase it, but like actually pulling it back to those like really, I guess, like base level feelings of like, do I feel cool when I'm playing this character is really, really important. Because if there's a character that you feel like you play and you're like, I don't really care, or I'm kind of bored, then I feel like, we need to go back and improve some things at that point. So that's like all kinds of directions that I take when it comes to making kits. Can I make each individual ability feel exciting? Okay, sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes they have to work in tandem with each other. Like Martichoras 2 was one that we struggled with for a really long time of like, how do we make this ability feel really impactful? And we were like, okay, well, what if we add interaction between this and other parts of his kit? Okay, now this starts to feel like you get a little bit more of that control, a little bit more of this like combo potential to be able to, feel like you're doing a lot of really cool things with it. And then it started to come together of like, okay, this is all now like adding up. Like he's able to have some of these really cool interactions that he didn't have before. And that's probably like one of the better examples of like an ability that changed over time, hopefully for the better. I mean, crossing my fingers, but it's always a very difficult and long process, and everyone's gonna have a different opinion too. Like some playtests were like, Charon's the most OP support we've ever play tested with. I know Atlas could pick up the Fire Giant, but I'm sick of playing into OP Charon. And I go, okay, do we need to nerf him? And then I have someone else saying, I don't think he did too much that game. I think he was very standard. And I go, what am I supposed to do with that?
Yeah.
You guys are giving me two different opposing directions. And then I go to the person that played them, and they were like, yeah, no, I had fun. And then I hear I had fun. I'm like, cool, we're good.
Is it easier to sort of nerf the characters after they release? Because I feel like there's been a history of, for the most part, and there's some characters that go against us like Baba Yaga, but I think there's been like a history where characters are just kind of like on the more OP end, and then you guys have to end up nerfing them over the next patch or two patches, sort of get them down to that neutral level.
Yeah, I guess in general, like people respond really, really well when things are on the extreme end. I kind of talk about this as like my general philosophy when it comes to designing is that, again, I kind of want people to feel like they are really, really powerful and really, really strong, because that's going to get people to immediately connect to the character when they feel like they have like, what was the word that I used to describe it? Not like God complex, you know what I mean? But like they feel strong. They're like, I'm doing things that no other character has done before. I feel like I'm dominating. And even if a character maybe isn't a character that they would normally connect with, if they have that experience of like destroying other people or feeling invincible, like I'm so tanky, I'm so escapable, I'm so good at CCing or damaging or doing whatever, they might be more open to the character just in general if they feel like they had a really fun experience crushing other people. Frankly, they might be more willing to go back and play the character more, and that kind of tends to be why we lean a little bit more towards the extreme, like strong end. And I think even just in general balance, that's true as well. When we do smaller buffs like 10 base damage, everyone goes 10 base damage, yeah, go off, I guess. But when we do like a bunch of buffs, like you'll see like 5 bullet points, people go, oh my god, is this character back? Are they like here? Like I gotta go test that. So that's kind of our general philosophy, and what I've learned has been more effective in getting people excited is seeing a lot of change or a lot of just like strength, I guess, in general, and then slowly bringing it back. Because once you get people excited about something, that's the hard part. That's the really, really hard part, is getting them to go, I want to try that. And then once we're there, we're like, awesome, we can adjust. But even if things are a little unbalanced, it is more useful for us to get more feedback if more people are playing them. And if the character is weak, the character doesn't feel very fun or satisfying or any of those things, then in general, we're going to be getting less feedback and just less, I guess, excitement around the character. And sometimes it's harder with other classes than others. With some classes than others, for instance, like Guardians can be a little tough to get that feedback on because people in Smite just don't like tanking for whatever reason. I'm trying to, I always try to make it make sense for me because, I'm a player and then I became an employee. So like, I look at it from like a bit of a player perspective where it was, like takes are really strong in certain, spaces. And I go, hey guys, in this arena that we're playing, if we've had like 2 frontliners, we'd be doing amazing. But everyone wanted to pick a mage. That kind of sucks. We're all dying. But, it's all about, like, how do we make that character appealing to those kind of players that don't really want to do that? We have to make them really strong for them to want to do that. And sometimes that works out better than others. We have a limited testing cycle internally before the character has to go live. So sometimes we don't hit the mark, and that it just tends to happen. Either they're way, 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 way too strong, or they're way too weak. In either direction, it's very rare that a character just like lands on the mark perfectly. Honestly, I'm surprised that Newt has not had to have any changes yet. That has been a very pleasant surprise for me to see that she is popular and she's like not crazy OP. I don't think that's ever happened for me before, so that's kind of cool, I guess. But yeah, in general, it's been the other way around, where we make super OP characters, quote unquote. But at least people get excited about them, so that's the cool part.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, I didn't really think about it like that. The more people that play the characters, the more data you guys get. And in return, the easier it is to be like, okay, well, we got to nerf this, this, and this about their kit. And all comes from that data aspect. So that is actually a very, very good point. And as for the Newt comment, yeah, I think like she seems to be like super strong on the early game, even in the late game too. But I think like part of her kit, and this is just me being a player, but I feel like part of her kit that makes her sort of balanced is I think that she doesn't have like she can get dove pretty easily. Like her dash doesn't go too far. I think it's even like shorter range than Merlin Flicker. I
Yeah,
want to
it's
say
shorter than Merlin.
yeah. So shorter than Merlin, and like her ult too isn't like super OP because yes, you banish yourself up in the air, but you have to land in the same exact spot like Rama. So it's I think those kind of aspects help balance her kit out because she does do a lot of damage. She's like a glass cannon, but in return, like you're gonna get dove. When it comes to putting a character in a certain class, how is that sort of decided? Do you guys predetermine how many classes you need ahead of time, or
Yeah. Typically, we have gone into the year and been like, hey guys, we're doing one of each class this year. Or in previous, years have been like, how can we do 2 mages but make them feel different? Or how can we do 2 ADCs but one of them's magical? Or maybe we do a guardian but he's actually a warrior, like Horus. Things of that nature. It's like, how do we do kind of something that's going to make every role happy throughout the year, or I guess like archetypes of players a little bit happy throughout the year. So we'll go into it saying, okay, we need this. What are characters that we can pull to kind of fit into that spot? So like for instance, I'm trying to remember like the years that I kind of mix them together now because it's all just like a blur between Smite 1 and Smite 2 especially. Like those schedules are crazy, but that's another point for another time. But yeah, I think it's like, how do we make these characters fit into these roles? But sometimes it's okay to be a little bit flexible with them. Like when Charon was getting made, the absolute goat row was not working in design at that point. But he's like, Lermy, I promise you this guy's a solo laner. And I'm like, Ro, I think you're a little bit biased, but go off, I guess. He was having a lot of fun. We had multiple people try Charon solo, and they were doing pretty good. They were having a good time with it. And that was really the part that I was finding really interesting about developing frontliners, because before then I hadn't worked on a frontline at all. And that part, I guess, is another topic where, the schedule line up in different ways, just depending on like, what have we not released since last year at this time, or what's the order that people are going to expect, like when do they want their hunter, when will the hunter mains be clamoring for another thing to try. That's kind of the things that we have to keep in mind when we determine the order. And just generally we need to fulfill every archetype, and we need to make sure that everyone's going to be like happy when they come out in the actual order that they're determined at that point.
and then like Benny Q broke the game by playing Charon mid. Oh yeah,
Yeah, that was an experience, I guess. I actually, it's a bit of an oopsie on my part, but I was like, I'm gonna make Charon have low damage. That was like my goal. Is like, he's a really heavy, like kind of enchanter style debuffer, and he doesn't really do damage, but he does a lot of CC. And then I go back and I look at his numbers, and I'm like, yeah, I didn't do that. Sometimes it happens like that, where like in playtesting, people are like, yeah, he's just not doing that much. And then people, like the really, really good, talented players, start to play them. And I'm like, oh, yeah, you can actually do way more with this than we had, anticipated or tested around. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes it's really cool to see like people try new things. We don't want to discourage people from doing new things. But when it's like the best thing in the role, it tends to be that people get a little bit frustrated when like they're like, their class more or less is like not for their role. So yeah, Charon mid, definitely cool. Was it frustrating? Probably. But it's exciting to see people try it. That's really the most exciting thing to me, is to see people want to do like cool and innovative things like with the characters, with the kits, with their builds. Is super, super neat. And again, sometimes things don't go as expected. Sometimes characters don't end up in the place where you would think they would be, but that's cool. I mean, for the longest time, I'm trying to think of another example, like Danza, when he came out, people were playing him in jungle, and I was like, I don't know how you're supposed to play this character in jungle, but it was working. People weren't ready for the rocket. Like, that's also another thing that you have to keep in mind as well, is when a character is brand new, people don't know how to play against it. People have no idea. So I think at least like now it starts to become a little bit more like, okay, people know how to play around the Danza rocket. They know how to play around the leaf. They know what to expect in that regard. But when he just came out, they're not looking for a leaf coming out of their jungle. They're not ready for the rocket. You know what I mean? So it works a little bit better in jungle. So, sometimes you get surprised by what the community comes up with as a designer, but it's always exciting. I always love to see just the innovation, and then we have to respond to it. And then that's when it becomes a little bit less exciting, a little bit like, oh, okay, guys, we got to calm down a bit here. But yeah, I'm trying to think if there was like anything super crazy with at least any of my characters that have come out. But I feel like the Charon mid was probably the like most crazy thing, I guess, out of them.
Yeah, when he it's funny, when he first came out, I looked at his numbers, like just the text and all that. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, it doesn't seem like he does that much damage. And like people just started like slapping damage items on him and like one-shotting everybody. I'm just like, oh, okay, I'm not sure what's going on anymore, but
yeah, the math wasn't mathing.
yeah, exactly. The math wasn't mathing at all.
But we adjust at that point. That's a live service game for you.
Yeah, definitely. One thing I was actually going to ask too was that the Mage class seems to have by far the most characters out of any class. Is there like a reason for that? I know you mentioned earlier that people just don't like playing tanks at all, and like people would like end up picking a whole bunch of mages. Do players just prefer mages more than any other class in the game?
I think generally, like if you were to look at the data, I obviously don't have it in front of me, but if I were to take my best guess, I would say probably yes. Mostly because there's just so much diversity between like your very traditional mages like your Raws and your Kukulkans to like your mage ADCs like your Souls and your Chronoses. You've got Maman Brashid and Ao Kuang in there. You've got your like super healers like Afro, Chang'e, Hell. All of those guys fit different niches, and theoretically they could be their own classes to an extent. But they all, at their base come down to like they are squishier magical characters, and that's kind of like what the mage class kind of is. And people tend to kind of want to be like the carry, I think, in a lot of circumstances, and mages kind of fulfill a lot of different ways to do that. And so I think they have kind of like this more like malleable role, mostly because they can do so many things, whereas hunters, people tend to like associate hunters with they have to be basic attackers, and they have to be able to do physical damage, and they have to be ranged, and all of these things, where it's a little bit more like boxed in as to what these characters have to be, whereas mages just tend to be a little bit more open-ended. In general, I think that it's not really like a specific effort from our end to make more mages. I think, for instance, there was like a very like small amount of like discontent around Maman Brigitte this year because they're like another mage, and I'm like, have you read her kit? I guess she's a mage, but like she's just a magical assassin. But sometimes it's hard to kind of convey that idea through like the paper, just like here's what she does. So I guess it kind of comes out to like, yes, there are more mages in the game than other classes, but they're also probably the most varied of all of the classes. And we don't specifically go into designing and picking gods being like, we want more mages than other characters, but we do try to make the characters feel thematic to what like they do. Like, for instance, it didn't make much sense for us to make Maman Brigitte a physical. Like, she just is such like a character that in her lore she does a lot of like magic. I mean, Baron, who's very similar to her, is also a magical character. So it just felt like them going hand in hand like really made a lot of sense, that we should just make her a magical assassin, because she still does a lot of the cool assassin stuff, but her attacks and abilities and just general like vibes definitely felt magical to us. It's kind of like another good example is like Ares, where like a lot of his attacks are kind of maybe on the more physical side of things, but when it comes down to like what he does as a character and what his vibes bring, he's definitely more of that like magical sort of enhanced like level of war versus like the very physical like crude Bologna style of war where like it just feels a little bit more like elevated and magical than just how like down like and very physical like hand-to-hand combat that like Bologna would get, even though they're both war gods.
Yeah, I mean, hey, listen, at least Ares like has flames coming out. Like those flames
Yeah.
got to come from somewhere, right?
Yeah, he's definitely got a very magical shield, you know?
Yeah. Oh, one thing I want to also get into are the item designs.
Yeah.
So for item designs, is it sort of the same design process that you go through with character designs, or are they like vastly different?
It's kind of similar. It's a lot less time. Usually items will take anywhere between 2 and 3 months is typically the difference there, and that's just because like a lot of the items don't need animation, sound and FX. Some of them do. Some of them will need that stuff, but most of the time items will just need programming and then design work. And then some artwork, you know, for the actual icon, unless we're reusing them, adjusting them, whatever it might be. But, you know, if we need a debuff cast on anybody, if we need to place something in the world, you know, like the runic bomb, like that is another really good example of like this needs to have some extra work done with it, and that could make it take a little bit longer. But yeah, in general, what we do is we kind of assess where can we even make new items, right? Do we have to make a new tree? If so, that begins to open a lot of questions like what class is this really meant for? Or who are we designing this for? What kind of archetype of characters? Or if we're trying to just fit something in the tree that's already defined for us, and we can kind of skip that step. But right now, especially, the trees are like basically full, which is a very interesting place to be, I guess, as a design team where we're working with like everything is like loaded right now because we just made 4 new tier 3 items, so that was a big effort on our end in terms of like filling out some of those spots that didn't have anything. So I can even just say like those items, I think it's Stormseeker, Duality, Curseweaver, and Equinox are like the big 4 that we wanted to do. Were like, what are cool things that we don't really have, or cool like just ideas in general of like, I want to, you know, do kind of Loki passive but on wheels for Equinox, or I want to do something interesting with like my HP and I want to steal HP and I want to, you know, what's another one? Stormseeker is like, it came from the idea of like, we had like a moment where we were doing a lot of infinite stacking stuff and we were like, what's a way that we can like, again, kind of put this on an item so more people can experience it than just your Charons and your Surters and everybody else. And we were like, okay, well, attack speed is something that we could do and have it stack up and feel pretty smooth throughout the game. You know, hitting basic attacks is always a really satisfying feeling. And especially with things like tablet, things like prophetic cloak, we were like, okay, people really like this mini game of seeing how many things they can hit. Basic attacks we haven't done yet, so let's do basic attacks. That sounds really like it fits the third niche that we weren't really touching because, you know, we had stuff for tanks, we had stuff for mages. Let's do stuff for carries. And that was a really fun process. It's like just going through the what do we not do, or what's a cool idea that you know, kind of fills the niche that these items are meant for.
Definitely. And how do you determine as well if new items need to be added to the game? Is it just to sort of shake things up, or maybe to help balance the game in like a different manner?
I would say in general, it's not typically like used for specific like balance. Like we're not saying like this is super OP or this is super underpowered, so let's put a new item in. It's usually for shakeups mostly and just giving new intrigue into builds. A lot of people don't focus too much on their items just in general. Like if people are playing Smite like just at a base level, they're playing Smite because they want to play the character they want to play, not so much the item builds. You know, some people feel a little bit more connected to the item builds and like that whole process and really enjoy that. But a lot of people are just like, I want to play Scylla every game. I want to play Neath every game. I want to play Afro every game. People will just do whatever build is meta. So generally, there's just a little bit less return on investment, putting a lot of effort into items specifically. Not to say we should never do that, right? Because again, it is a big mix up and people do get excited to try something new. And, you know, see which character breaks which item, and like if there's a combination of items that go together and make an absolutely crazy build. those are things that people do get excited about. So there is, some value in doing those things. When it comes to the actual ideas themselves, it's mostly, at least at this point, it's a lot around working around limitations that we have, because a lot of our department are working on Smite 2. So we're like, okay, how far ahead can we plan now to make some of these things a reality? And so the reality of working in game dev is that these timelines get longer and longer as the resources start to change around and shift. So for instance, we started planning these past 4 items in 11.1, I think, was when we started saying, hey, we want more items later this year. So we had to go to the art department, like, hey guys, can you make more icons for us? And they're like, if you give us 3 months, we can. And I'm like, awesome, cool, we'll do it in 3 months then. So those kind of things do take some time. So it comes with a little bit of planning of like, is everyone cool with this if we do this? And I slowly hear, yeah, no, we can do that. That's cool, yeah. And then we start to actually get into the meat and potatoes of like, what does this item actually look like? What does this item do? I know we were initially planning to put all 4 of those items in the same patch, and then that just didn't end up working out because we wanted to essentially rework what Curseweaver and Duality did. Because we were just feeling like they weren't hitting the mark. They weren't very exciting. They were just kind of adding extra damage and didn't feel very unique in the grand scheme of things. Whereas we were pretty happy with where Equinox and Stormseeker ended up. We were like, okay, these are feeling unique. They feel, rewarding and exciting in terms of like the just general gameplay loop. And like, maybe one was a little overpowered and one was a little underpowered, but that happens.
The ducky
playtesting is very, very variant. So sometimes you get people that are really, really good that roll up and they get 500 stacks in their Stormseeker. We go, oh crap, are we going to actually have to be worried about people hitting 500 autos in the game and getting like this many Stormseeker stacks? But the reality is, no, we don't have to worry about that. They have overestimated a bit how many autos people are hitting, but that's a story for another day. But yeah, essentially, we delayed Curseweaver and Duality to kind of rework them on the programming end. Mostly because we wanted to add additional functionality and additional like build tie-ins as well. And even from there, like Duality had to receive a bunch of changes because sometimes the intent of the item just doesn't really fit what people are expecting it to do. So it's a lot of moving and shaking. I mean, like Duality just in general came from a place of like, I want to see more people start to open their builds in different ways if they want to. Like, I want to give an item that can make Rom use whatever items that he wants. Like, he doesn't, like, if he builds Transcendence, it's not Troll anymore, guys, I swear. Or if he builds, these other, ability proc items when he has no abilities, that's not as, like, again, Troll. Like, it just lets people have more freedom in what they build. And so we had to kind of shift a little bit from that to actually make the item feel like it can stand on its own 2 feet, which is a very challenging thing to do, is to like make an item that just works on its own and doesn't rely so much on other things while still feeling like it can be better with other things. And Curseweaver is a good example of that, where it relies on your max health and mana. That was the thing that we added partially into the design, because we were like, okay, we want this to be kind of like a tankier magical item. And then we were like, okay, well, you can still just use this on mages, and it's like really like solid on mages. How do we like really influence or like encourage people to do more of this like build tie-in? And then we were like, well, we can include these other staffs, and then we had to go back to programming for that. That takes time. Oh snap, we have to delay this. So there are things that don't always work out at the start, but I think the general philosophy around this kind of level of change, just in general, it can be for gods, it can be for items and systems. If we're feeling like it's not hitting the mark, we're not going to push it out just to do change for the sake of change. We want to really be happy with the levels of changing that we're due and feel excited ourselves. Like, for instance, like me and Ro are like, we play Smite basically every day. Like, we love Smite as players, and obviously like Ro was in the pro league for a long time. I've been a really big fan of it, just in general. So like we understand like what the quality level and like the expectations should be just in general. And we want to be excited about them too as players. Like when we were talking about, I know tier 2s is kind of like a hot example right now. But me and Ro had a lot of fun brainstorming some wild and wacky things that you could do with those. And I think we got a little bit too caught up in the sauce there in terms of like the small like micro level things and kind of missed the mark a little bit on like the macro level things. But that's kind of like an example of like what we'll do is like we want to feel like the system is exciting and something that we would be wanting to try and experiment with ourselves as players.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And actually, like kind of going to a topic of balancing, so balancing all these new items, balancing everything, characters as well. What kind of performance metrics are you guys looking for when balancing?
Oh yeah, it's a lot of things.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
The biggest thing that comes up during our balance meetings is the perception of characters and items. One of the best examples that I can kind of think of off the top of my head is like Yamoja, right? It's like a very, very hot topic of this character. If you look at her, just at her data, she is one of the worst performing characters in the game. She loses so much. And then we go, well, what does the community actually think of her? And they're like, yeah, like she's like balanced. Like she's cool. I'm like, she has a 43% win rate. Like, are you guys sure? They're like, yeah, no, we're chilling. Yamoja's fine. Yeah, she's fine. And we're like, okay, I guess we're not changing her then, even though the data says she is just not good. Sometimes it's not actually like that. And in general, a lot of players of Smite will not dive deep into those numbers and those metrics because frankly they just don't care. They only care about what they're experiencing right in front of them, and that's what matters the most to them. And that's not an invalid way to experience Smite. Like you don't have to care about the micro numbers and like who's the best god. Like if some people are like playing at lower levels, let's just say, and they keep running into Ares and they keep getting ulted by Ares, they'll say to me, Ares is the most OP god in the game. His ultimate's crazy. Why does he do so much damage? Yada, yada, yada. They'll say all these things, right? But that's that one player's perception of Ares. Is that actually true? That's our job to find out, I guess, at the end of the day. But it's really about discerning, what is the majority voice of the community saying that are OP, underpowered, etc. What can we buff? What can we nerf without making people too upset? Because again, people have a lot of connection to the characters that they play. If I say to an Aphrodite main, hey man, I'm cutting your healing in half because your character has a 60% win rate. I'm just making numbers up. They go,
Yeah.
What the heck, man? I was having fun with that. And obviously that's not a fun experience for really anyone at that point because even though this character is clearly overperforming, they are no longer having fun with that character in this example, right? So it's a tough balancing act. See what I did there? Of like trying to appease the most amount of people while still obeying some level of metrics, right? So the general, like when you ask about metrics, we talk about win rate, we talk about popularity, we talk about ban rate, is a really, really big one. Of just what do people not want to play against? And for the longest time, the answer has been Thanatos. And slowly, Thanatos has been creeping down the ban rate we've been watching, especially this year, because it's so hard because people love Thanatos. Like, he's a very popular character because he's just one of those characters that is very extreme in his playstyle, but he's also really frustrating in some regards, right? So the players that play Thanatos are like, I love one-shotting people with my scythe. Players that play against it, I hate getting one-shot by Thanatos scythe. That sucks. So it's a bit of like, how do we make both of those people happy? But clearly a lot of people are unhappy when he's got over a 50% ban rate. So something's got to change there. And I think now more than ever, we're looking at those numbers because usually, in the past when there's been like SPL and very public, like pro level, like commentary and metas, it's been a lot easier for the community to be united on those things because they have like a very central, like, these guys are telling me what's OP and what's underpowered, right? These are the guys that are like setting the standard. And since that's not as big of a thing right now, it's more like a little bit split up between content creators who have different opinions. It's a lot harder to actually find things that people are united on as like, this character needs a nerf or this character sucks or any of those things. At this point, we're focusing a lot more on like stats, just because that's the more consistent thing. And then we kind of go to our player brains. We're like, okay, we've identified a list of characters. In our player brains, if we saw that there was a buff for Merlin, are we going to go, what the heck are they doing? What are they on? So it's questions that we have to ask ourselves like that, where it's like, how bad does the character have to be for people to actually think they're bad? Or maybe, why do people think they're bad? This character has a 60% win rate. Like Arachne is a really good example of that, where like Arachne is super, super good in pub stomp games and just absolute dog water in other games where she has to be a lot more team fight oriented. But she has a really high win rate because there's just so many of those like normal conquest games that are pub stomps like that. And just that's the way that they're played. But the general perception about Arachne is that she's bad because she doesn't function in those more like publicized, bigger kind of name like game experiences. So people think that she's bad, but actually she's not bad. So we have to say, well, everyone says Arachne's bad, but we can't buff her because look at her stats. And then everyone continues to say Arachne's bad, Arachne's bad, Arachne's bad, C tier, D tier, F tier, like, and we just go, well, you know, I don't think we can win this fight. Sometimes we try to do things, and that ends up being either really cool, really not cool, or kind of in the middle. You know, I think a lot of the times we try to be a little bit safer with characters like that because we know that their opinion could be so volatile. But in general, I think the biggest like proponent that we focus on is what is going to ring right in the player's ears if they see that we're buffing things or we're nerfing things. Like, what will the majority agree on as that makes sense? That's cool. And not to say that we don't ever touch the numbers, right? Because there are so many different things that we can do. Like, we can break down to the level of like damage per 5 minutes or like farm or deaths or things like that, like, and kind of narrow in on like what specific parts are not working more than others. Like, for instance, we were talking with Max, who is our data analyst, about like Yu Huang. I remember this very, very vividly in a balance meeting where it's like Yu Huang like is fine, right? And he goes, yeah, he's fine, but he has one of the highest deaths per minute out of most of the mages. And I'm like, what? Are you serious right now? Like, what do you mean? And so that kind of gave us the best example of like, okay, well, if he's dying a lot, we probably should up his safety. We probably should change the way that his safety works. So that will give us a little bit more direction on like what we specifically do. Or like, for instance, Vulcan is another really good example on like the opposite end of the spectrum where we just buffed his turret by giving it pet procs. So now it can, you know, do all the Gem of Isolation, Divine Ruin, Soul Reaver, all that fun stuff. We probably should nerf the thing that everyone is like, hey guys, this is really strong. So we nerfed the turret. Because that's what people want. And maybe the turret, you know, didn't change his win rate all that much. It's hard to say sometimes, you know, because damage is a bit more nebulous. We don't have breakdowns to like the level of which skill is doing the most damage, but maybe in Smite 2 that changes. I mean, our data analysts are absolutely goated, so they're working really hard to put a lot more of that tracking in so we can keep more tabs on really like broken down information like that for the future. But in general, like it comes down to what is the community going to think makes the most sense. And sometimes we can convince them with data, but that's really, really, really hard to be like, hey guys, Merlin has a 37% win rate and that's why you have to buff him. And everyone goes, but Merlin's fine right now, dog. Like, what are you talking about? And then I go, yeah, well, Merlin typically sits at like 43 to 45. So he's like 6% lower than normal, which is like crazy. And they go, yeah, Merlin's fine, dog. What are you talking about? And that some of those efforts are a little bit wasted, I will say, but sometimes we can convince them with the data. It's always important to share the data though, because we are looking at it.
Right.
But it doesn't always convince people.
So what's like the optimal win rate that you guys would like to have a character at? Is it like 50%?
It's tough to say because every character is different, right? Like every character has a different like optimal number because the community will be happy with King Arthur when he's at 45%. The community will be happy with Arachne when she's at 60%. Like there's different levels for different characters that function best in different spaces, you know what I mean? Like everyone goes, yeah, like Giannis is pretty solid right now. Oh, he's got a 45% win rate? Yeah, no, that's chill. Like he feels good. Like if we buff him to get to that 50% mark, the like balance mark, I guess, it is not quite like a place where people would be happy with. Like I think if we just went out and said we want to make every character 50%, I think the game would not be balanced at all. It would feel very, very you know, it would be skill testing for sure because you'd have characters. Well, I guess maybe it'd be less skill testing, right? Because with characters like Giannis, like Set, like you know, Yamoja, the characters that tend to have lower win rates because they're just harder characters, it tends to make them, I guess, easier characters to get them to that higher win rate. So you just have less of those characters, which I think people would be, you know, not very happy about. They really do enjoy the characters that have really complicated mechanics and are really rewarding at the top end of it. So you can even see like squishing between like players with lower MMR and then higher MMR, and then as you slowly creep up, yeah, that win rate's going up. Yeah, it's going up. So you can kind of identify those characters doing it in that direction as well, where it's like, are these characters better for less skilled players or good skilled players, and it'll kind of tell you like which side of the 50% line it'll sit on. But generally, if people are happy with where they're at, that's like their 50%. You know what I mean? It's like
Right,
if
right.
they think that the character is good and like playable, then they are happy with where they're at, which, for some characters is 60%. For some characters is 40%. It really just depends.
So one thing I wanted to ask too was like how hard it is to sort of balance between lower end elo and higher end elo, because I remember when I was first climbing up, before I got to the high level leagues, I remember like Kumba was super OP in like the lower
Yeah.
level games, like so broken. Everybody's like ban Kumba, ban Kumba. This is back when first person was banning all the characters. And then as I get up to like Masters and GM, it's like Kumba doesn't exist. Like, what's a Kumba? so like there's definitely like a much different meta between sort of lower elo, higher elo. And I feel like that has to be like really hard to balance. And could you like touch up on that a little bit?
Yeah, no, it definitely can be. I think one of the ways that we tend to look at balance is we do kind of section off into like those ELO or like MMR levels of like, what do the good players think? What do the not so good players think? And what are ways that we can change these characters that cater to either aspect of them? Like if this character is doing really poorly in high level games, I know for a long time it was like Athena was like absolutely dominating the lower end of things, which just like was invisible in upper end. um, it's like, how do we make this character a little bit more skill testing? Where if you're a really good Athena player, this is going to reward you a lot more. Like, what are things that we can do with that? Or, for instance, with like Set or Yamoja or any of these other like classic characters, what are things that we can do that don't necessarily damage the skill testing aspect of them, but still make the character feel more approachable to some of those players that aren't going to engage in the same level with like Omi or portaling through half the entire map or whatever Set has to do, just get in there. It's very challenging to kind of isolate those things that make those characters work differently, but sometimes there'll be things that are pretty obvious to certain like levels of play. Like I think Set is another good example of like people for the longest time were like, please, please, please nerf the mitigation on his 3. That was like one very, very clear point to us that we're like, okay, but who is this mitigation helping more? Is it helping the players that are actively knowing to get in there? Or is it helping the players that are just pushing the button and don't really understand what they're doing? Who is that helping more? And that's a very, very tough thing to reckon with sometimes, because a lot of the people on the design team are people that know Smite and feel Smite in like closer to that upper end thing. Like I'm not gonna say like we're pro players, because I mean some of us were, not me. But some of them were. Like Ro was a coach for a long time, and like back in the day, like Pan and Clumsy played a lot of pro. I mean Aggro was on a console pro team for a long time. Like we tend to bias ourselves just naturally towards the skill players, so we really have to like go back and like make sure we're doing things that are going to help the people that need it the most. And that's tough, man, because a lot of the people that are lower skill don't have as strong opinions as the people at the top end do. They tend to have really strong opinions because they dissect things and they really want to know why XYZ character is performing the way that they are. Whereas the lower end players would be like, yeah, I died a lot. And it's hard to really like break down that feedback at that same level, because it's both a good and a bad thing, right? Because sometimes the higher end players, like I said, they love to dissect. They'll get really stuck on the one thing that they think is breaking the character, or the one thing they think is really OP, and they'll say, if you don't do this, you're stupid, Hi-Rez. And we'll go, yeah, man, I guess we are. I don't know.
It's so
um,
hard. It's so hard.
it's like it's a lose-lose, honestly, but at the end of the day, I think just making changes period are things that people can get excited about. I think we don't lose at all if we make a change. It just is like, is this specific change the one thing that everyone wants? No, okay, they're upset, but is the thing that we changed actually moving the needle on them? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We're not a perfect design team by any means. We're not a perfect balance team. And like I said, obviously we lean a little bit more toward that experience side of things, just because it's kind of something we have to do for our job. And what makes us, I guess, better character designers in a way as well, is like having that knowledge of like combining things, right? But we always do try to get opinions from as many players as we possibly can in the like balancing phase. Like for instance, right now we have the ambassador program, which we typically run our balance by. kind of as a precursor to like gauging initial community reactions. And sometimes we'll go, okay, we thought that was going to be chill. It wasn't as chill as we thought it was. We have to either bring it back some, change it to something different, or they'll go, why didn't you do this instead of this? And like sometimes we'll explain it to them and they'll get it and they'll be chill with it afterward and they'll be like, oh yeah, that's awesome. But you can't feed that information to everybody, which is another like kind of impossible problem of like kind of what I talked about earlier with like the math of like I can give you guys as much data as you want, but like if I don't check the patch notes ever, if I don't watch the update show, how am I ever supposed to know that that's a thing that like went through your minds, when you're making it? So it's always going to be someone's going to be unhappy, but someone's going to be happy, and we try to maximize the amount of people that are going to be happy versus unhappy. And sometimes we have to lean a little bit more towards that player experience because, or like the experienced players, I guess I should say, just because they have more specific opinions, and that just tends to be way more helpful when people have opinions versus they just think it's really strong and they don't necessarily like know why.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, one of the things I think that I really, well, not that I think, one of the things that I really liked that you guys did, I believe this might have been in season 9, maybe 10ish, was sort of the um having like sort of conquest specific patches, and then you
Yeah.
have like the rest of the game. And I thought that was really cool because the way I sort of view Smite is that conquest is sort of that more competitive style of base of the game, right? I mean, you got SPO, Pro League, you got many tournaments that are hosted on conquest, and then you have a lot of casual game modes that a lot of casual players seem to enjoy. And so one of the things that I thought was just really smart was like, okay, if we're going to buff a character or do XYZ to this character, maybe we just kind of do this in conquest, because maybe more of the higher end players, obviously I don't know what kind of data you guys are looking at, but maybe more of the higher end players are enjoying this or think that this is a better buff, whereas like the lower end players might not enjoy this as much. So we'll keep this just in conquest alone.
Yeah, they're also just like fundamentally different modes, right? Where like
Yeah.
arena is just like that mode is magic, bro. I don't know how that mode works, but it just does. Joust especially is another beast on its own, and obviously assault is a little bit unbalanced, but that's part of the natural like part of the mode. That's like the bit you go to assault to get something random. Like it's not going to be the most balanced thing, and thankfully people have accepted that aspect of it to an extent, right? We've had to do things like the healer tiers in assault, and things like that. But when we do like non-conquest balance, it's not so much like a skill level testing thing as it is more so like what is good in this mode? What does this mode ask of players that is different than what's asked of them in Conquest? And does that make XYZ character better or worse for that? So like for instance, a lot of assassins, it tends to be, get buffs in non-conquest modes because they just need to single target a lot of the time, or they need to be sneaky or gank. And let me tell you, ganking in arena, I don't know if that's even possible, bro. I don't think you can do it. You can try and
Hide
be
behind the
sneaky,
little
but
columns.
they'll see you. Yeah, yeah. Good luck. So a lot of the characters need some help for that reason. Whereas on the other side of things, they do perfectly fine in Conquest because there are so many, branching pathways. There's a lot more element of surprise in those modes as well. And there's just so much more macro going on that doesn't challenge those characters in the same way that it does when there's just less of that sort of thing to do and it's more team fight oriented, or like in Just where it's a lot more like about pushing and managing resources and poking. Those characters, most of them don't do that. So that's why they need buffs. Or characters that are just not as worried about those macro level things, like Zeus, Apwash are really good examples of two characters that have classically struggled a lot more in Conquest because they just really struggle in a lot of the like macro level play. They don't have those same issues in the other modes, so they're way stronger in those modes than they are in Conquest. And that tends to be why we look at certain characters in certain ways. Or, if the character like fundamentally like Kepri, it's just like a frustrating character in those modes because you're like, I see Kepri, I see Athena every game, and all they do is taunt me and revive my ally or their allies, and it just becomes like this kind of frustration point. Those are other things that we tend to look at. Like Aphrodite is another really good example where like she can be played in Conquest and do perfectly fine, but in other modes she's a lot more popular because she has this constant support of her other teammates that she just doesn't have in Conquest. So there are things like that when it comes to like the fundamental of the character or how they have to function in the mode that changes a lot based on what mode they're in.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Actually, now that we're on topic of balancing and all that, one thing I want to ask was, with the most recent changes, uh, flat pen onto ADCs, which I'm super excited to try next patch. Like more flat pen. I think we're adding it to Aussie. You guys are adding it to Aussie and also Stormseeker and maybe a few others. Not sure, but what was like sort of like the whole decision making behind that?
God, hunters are tough, right? Because there's always this constant battle of hunter items have everything, and this item's not good if it doesn't have everything. Where it's like you don't really know like which side you want to win. Just because like okay, like we don't want to make hunter items bloated, but at the same time, they're not going to pick up the item unless it has the stats that they need, right? They're just so like efficient at this point that it feels weird to take that away from them at the same time, right? Because then that just changes like the whole balance of the hunter class. If you were to say like, okay, well, you say everything has too much, then we're going to take away pen, we're going to take away crit, we're going to do all of these things that they've asked for. It just gets a little complicated to actually do that because then people again kind of go to that nerf bias a little bit where it's like, well, now I'm losing some of that thing that made me feel really strong, and that makes me sad. And at the end of the day, we're trying to make people feel happy and excited, and not so much of that my class sucks. So it's hard. It's very, very hard to do those kind of things without, damaging that feeling. And realistically, at the end of the day, we kind of lean a little bit more towards giving people the good feeling versus like trying to be 100% balanced. Again, because the balance point of like 50%, right? That's kind of what I always go back to. That game's not going to be very fun. It's not going to be very exciting. We want to make sure that people have things to be excited about and things to grasp onto. And of course, balancing out power creep is its own like struggle, right? That's a whole different topic that I could spend a lot of time talking about. But realistically, it's about like we could rework the entirety of all of the ADC items to be a little bit more balanced and a little bit more like fair and feel like maybe less stat efficient. But is that going to make people happy? Probably not. It's easier for us to give the items competitive stats than it is to shuffle things around in that way. And sometimes, it is better to do the harder option, but it is really, really disruptive, which, we have seen in the past that really disruptive game-changing patches, I'm not going to name names, have been, not the most enjoyable to some certain individuals. So I do think that just in general, and this is my own opinion, right? The opinions of other designers vary a little bit. It is easier to try to play with what we already have than to break it all down and build anew. And again, sometimes the harder thing is the better thing to do, the right thing to do. But if it ever gets to a breaking point, we can adjust it then. But honestly, I've been very, very happy with where like the general like balance is amongst the roles at this point in time. And like, yes, many hunter items do have 4 stats, and they're all 4 banger stats that you want on like basically any ADC item. But does that make the role feel like they're powerful? Yeah, it does. And that does, lend itself to being a positive thing in some regards.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, one of the things I did want to get into was like just touch upon briefly was the 9.5 update.
Yeah.
So the revert. For those of you that don't know, 9.5 was a mid-season patch, right? Yeah, it was a mid-season patch that pretty much, just to sum it up, made everything tankier. So all the players' characters were pretty much tankier. They got increased base stats and I guess like stats per level. Same thing with the NPCs as well. And also structures like phoenixes and towers also became tankier. Or
They
were they
became
the
a
same?
little bit tankier, and then they also dealt more damage. So it's kind of the 1-2 of like, if minions are going to be tankier, the structures still have to kill them, so they have to do more damage to those as well.
Yeah. So with that patch, I know obviously a lot of people are super excited about the revert. I'm one of them. It's all over Twitter. Why choose now to revert 9.5?
It's a couple things. I think the most important thing when it comes to the very, very specific like meat and potatoes of why now is that we clearly missed the mark on the amount of content for a mid-season patch, and we understand that. But at this point, we are just very limited in terms of what we can work with at this point in time. Just due to a publishing schedule, how we typically have to do it is we have to basically be pencils down on patches weeks ahead of time to make sure that we can send it to Xbox and Microsoft and Sony and Nintendo, and just make sure that everyone's like, yeah, cool, we can put this on our systems, because that is a really, really important thing when it comes to the financials of Smite, and I guess just games in general, is making sure these patches make it to all these different places, because Smite does have a really big console player base, and if they're not getting a patch, that's a really big problem.
Yeah.
So when it comes to what we can do without having to go through that cycle, there's a really, really limited amount of things that we can actually do. So 9.5 just became this really big overnight kind of topic in the community. Like there were some rumblings about it before, but it never felt like the community was really united to be like, yeah, you know what? 9.5 was not the best thing. People were kind of a little bit more on the fence about it. They're like, yeah, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But I think really it was kind of the 1-2 sucker punch of like, just feeling like this was not enough of a mid patch. So you're like, okay, what can we do? This is a big discussion point. This is actually really unique in terms of like what it would take to adjust this, to the point where like we don't have to adjust any item descriptions and things like that, which typically gets held up in that like certification process. We don't have to do any of those things. This is something that we can do right now without disrupting our publishing process. So let's do it. It's more content. It's things the community is united on. It's things that are going to make the game feel really, really different. And in general, like if you were to ask me my personal opinion about it, I'm not the biggest 9.5 truther in the world. I do think that there is some merit to having a little bit of that tankiness, but I think most people are really reasonable about it. Most people are like, we don't have to be completely in pre 9.5 world. We can be somewhere in the middle and still feel good, which I think is very, very reasonable of a lot of the opinions of people. But I think, again, and I've kind of talked about this before, if things aren't extreme, they're not going to feel it or be interested by it. So like for instance, when it comes to buffing power and items, we put 5 power in item, you're like, great, awesome, 5 power, that's so sick. Whereas if we say all health is nerfed by 25%, you go, oh my god, that's crazy, that's huge, that changes so much, right? It's just like the level of impact that those changes have. We felt like that was gonna really hit the nail on the head of like, okay, this is a really big change that we can do to help add more to this patch. Is like the number one. Number 2 is this actually works within our publishing schedule that we can work with. And then number 3 is everyone's kind of united on this in terms of just wanting to feel something different, wanting to try something different, and just see what a different time to kill looks like in the current world of Smite as well. Because we had pre 9.5, but we've never had the same kind of aspect applied to current Smite with all of the new characters, with all of the new items, with all the new objectives. Like when we were working through this revert, and we're still working through it at this time, we're crossing our fingers that everything's going to work out for Tuesday. We would love to get it to people's hands on Tuesday, but we'll see. Maybe in the future, we'll know. But we have been working really hard to do a lot of these changes behind the scenes at this point. And I just hope that people understand like that this is coming from a place of passion on our behalf. This is something that we wanted to do because we recognize that as players, like people were not satisfied. We were a little bit narrow on our scope this time around because again, we are working on so many different things at the same time, especially with Smite 2 coming up. We were just like, we think that this will be enough. And clearly it was not enough. So these are kind of, the reasons why we picked this thing in particular to do. We could have done a lot of things, right? People have said, just make more items, just make more god changes. At this point in the process, we can't do that. But we want to do something, right? So this kind of hit all 3 of those niches to like, let's do it, man. If this is what people want to try, it's going to be something new. It's going to be something exciting. We're just going to go into a whole new era of Smite, I guess, with this new time to kill stuff. So we're hoping that people are going to feel like the game feels significantly different. The pacing is going to be different. The macro and characters that are good are going to be different. So I'm just hoping that people really enjoy all of the experimentation that's going to come from that, because we don't want people to be dissatisfied. At the end of the day, we're players ourselves. Basically everyone at the company, all we want is for people to have fun, and we appreciate genuinely. Like, I know there's a lot of like vitriol and you can say even toxicity to a certain extent of people on Twitter and Reddit and all of that stuff, but at the end of the day, like, it's all valid criticism. Everyone's entitled to their opinion and how they feel about the game, and if they're not having fun, that's an issue. So we need to fix that. So I just want everyone to know that we took this very seriously, and this was not a decision that we came to lightly. We spent, it seems like it happened really fast, but really it happened kind of in slow motion, where we were like, oh snap, like what do we do? And this kind of came up to be the best of every single world. And we're just hoping that people like it, and we're very thankful for all the criticism, and we will continue to balance it. This is not jobs done. We have a lot more to do, but we're working hard. I mean, me and Ro have been working basically around the clock to make sure that everything is going to be good to go for Tuesday. So let it be known that we're working hard and we're very passionate about this stuff, as I'm sure a lot of people know. This is a game that we have grown up with, and we want to make sure that everyone's enjoying it.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be very exciting, and there's gonna be a lot of dead bodies on Tuesday when everybody's weaker.
Yeah, there sure will be. We've been looking at some of the numbers and comparing them to what they were before, and it's crazy to load into a map with 400 HP. I will just say that.
Well, it's funny. I was thinking back to what you said earlier about people not really sort of looking at the stats as much, having more abstract point of view,
Yeah.
when you play the game, and versus just kind of like caring about what's in front of you. And maybe that's kind of what happened with 9.5 a little bit as well, because I know from reading the dev notes that you guys posted out over the last few days, one of the reasons you changed it to 9.5 was to pretty much help stop all the F6ing in the early game, and
Yeah.
it like worked. But like you said, people were on the fence about it. Like obviously, like more players in the upper part of the community, because I've talked with a few SPL players about this too. Really didn't like it. So yeah, I guess it is really just that conflict between statistics, because statistically speaking, it was working. What you guys want to implement succeeded, but at the same time too, wasn't really um received by the community as well.
Yeah, it just depends on your perspective, I think.
Yeah.
Worse players just tend to die more. That's just how it is. And in a situation where they're going to be dying even more than before, they're probably not going to be happy players, right? But in certain extents, like it kind of turns into the other side of the coin for the more experienced players, where there's a lot more risk now than there was before. And risk is really, really exciting for those players, and having to, really express their skill in how they position and stay alive, make less mistakes than other players. So it's all about finding like that balance between how many times am I going to sit on the grayscale screen without feeling upset and wanting to get out of this game. And it's very, very difficult to actually find a scientific value for that. It's going to be a lot of testing, a lot of iteration. So like I said, job's not done, but we'll hopefully get a lot of at least excitement around trying so many new things, especially with the tier 2s. I think combining these two systems as well is going to be really interesting, because power spikes are going to be crazy different than they were before. Especially with the flat pen, like you were talking about. I know that's a really big discussion, and like hybrid jungles is another thing that we're keeping an eye on. Like what was it yesterday? Stu sent us the Zapman tweet of saying Black Thorn Hammer in pre 9.5 world is about to be a disaster or something. I'm like, don't worry, we got that on our list. There's a lot of theory crafting going on right now, and I'm really excited to see it in action and see what we need to adjust, because obviously there's going to be something. We have a balance meeting scheduled basically immediately after the patch to be like, what's going on? What do we need to change? So needless to say, we are preparing for whatever we have to do. We'll keep doing it. And hopefully there's just a lot of exciting stuff. I'm looking forward to seeing just how statistically the deaths are going up, because they will be.
I know I'm going to be dying a lot. People say I in a lot in ADC. That number is going 0-20 at least.
Yep.
Also, with these quality of life changes that you guys have been doing this year, really, really cool, by the way, like really awesome.
Yeah.
The Maui hook, I think, is awesome change, although I think I've saved a couple people with it because of the increased speed, but that we'll leave that aside. Is it more of an experimentation or like a bridge for what's to come in Smite 2?
It's a little bit of both. If I'm being like totally frank, like some of these things have come to be this way because we are a little bit limited on what new content we can make. But adjusting old content is a lot easier because we can, change functionality without having to, make new things for a bunch of different skins. Like for instance, the Kali change coming up was actually a change that had to sit for several months because that did require going through effects, it required going through programming, it required going through UI. Like there were a lot of pieces that had to come together, and that stuff is just a lot more challenging right now because again, we're putting a lot of work and focus into Smite 2. So when we want to do big things like that, it has to go through a really, really big process. And for a lot of players, it's really hard to see, those layers. Like what makes this Kali change different from that Maui change, which by the way, was super easy to implement and basically like took 5 minutes of my time to do.
Really?
Yeah, so there's things where we have the tools as designers to do them, and there's things where we don't. A lot of things that involve art, involve UI, involve animation. That stuff is just so much harder to do because it requires going through other departments, because obviously I'm not an artist. But it is just very interesting to see people kind of talk about this, like, why now? I think as well, a lot of our player base is kind of shifting to be a lot more veterans. Like, the veterans are the ones that stick around and like really care about this stuff a lot more. So they truly appreciate this focus on quality of life and just general like experience improvement a lot more than most players do. And I think as well, like, I know with the big timing pass that happened, moderately recently, I want to say it was like 11.3 or something. I lose track of the patches now, I'm going to be honest with you. Working between 2 games and like 4 patches at a time is like really crazy.
It's got to be
But
hard. It's got to be hard.
it's hard to keep things straight what's on the notes sometimes when I sit down and do patches. I'm like, oh yeah, we changed that in this patch. Awesome. It's a reminder. But yeah, anyway, those things were actually part of discoveries going into Smite 2, those timing changes where we're basically building Smite from the ground up in Unreal 5. And one thing that Ponpon was actually the one that discovered, like, the timing issues, is that like there's different account abilities that you have to make, kind of, or things that you have to take into account for like lag and projectiles being spawned and things like that. It gets to really like technical terms of like how this information is communicated between server and client, to the point where some characters were just not matching their animations. And in Smite 2, you could really feel that. And so Ponpon was making these changes on characters like Onher and Cernanos and all of these different characters that he's working with. Mostly projectiles is where you feel it the most, because it becomes like a separate entity from you that travels on its own. Where we just felt like, okay, we can actually take some of these things that they're learning in Smite 2 and apply it to characters in Smite 1. And we started small, right? Because we're sort of like, how are these things going to affect the game? Are players actually going to notice these changes? And we got like a pretty solid response from a lot of the characters we worked on. So it was my job for like a solid week to go through every single ability in the game and retime it based on their animations, which was really fun. But I was working a lot that week. So it's kind of an art more than a science as well, because you go, okay, how much change actually is enough to see a difference? And a lot of those changes, like, I know we didn't publish the actual like times that we shipped it, but they were fractions of a second. And just the fact that you could identify a difference in the timing for something that's less than 1/10 of a second, like, blew my mind. I'm like, that's crazy that this feels so much better when I change it by that little. And of course, there were concerns with that system as well, of like, does this now suddenly mess up like my timing? Like, the Uller X change from a long time ago was kind of controversial because it did change the way that you had to aim the ability. And yes, these changes also did do that kind of thing, but not to the same extent. Like, players on the other end of it didn't see much of a difference, whereas players that were playing it felt a huge difference. And that was like a 2 thumbs up amazing win for us in that regard. And also, I think to kind of shift topics a bit to kind of the more like kit changing or kit like updating changes, a lot of those have come from a place of like, we have played these characters ourselves and we feel like there's clunk in some way, or there's modernizing that we could do, or there's a system that we think that we can include in this that's really, really fun and awesome. Like, I talked about this yesterday in the Dev Insights, but I asked people at the office, I'm like, what is a character that you play that you feel like is really clunky or slow or doesn't feel like everything in their kit like flows together? And I was talking to Billy, who is the one of the producers for the Esports show, when I was in the office. And so he was like, yeah, Cerberus. And I'm like, okay, yeah, no, I kind of agree with that. Like, I can see there's a little bit of clunk going on with Cerberus. And so at that point, we kind of went into the lab, I guess you could say, and we're like, okay, what can we do with Cerberus? And so I was looking through like his different effect groups, because that's an effect group is essentially like where we have all the different things that he does. Think of it kind of like a container for like his damage and his timings and all that stuff. So we started tweaking with those, and I see this one container that has a cripple in it. And I'm like, what if we just like get rid of that? What if we just like get rid of it and see what happens? We tried it, and I was like, I call up Ro, I call up Ponpon, I called up all the boys. I said, roll into this meeting right now. Tell me what you think of this. Tell me how this looks. Tell me how this feels. And they were like, yeah, dude, that's sick. Like, let's do it. And so that tends to be like how the changes for these guys have happened, has been like, what can we do within the scope that is just really interesting and really fun? And I think in general, it's not to say that balance has gone out the window, right? Because you might look at that serve change and say he can jump how far and bring people how long, and is that even fair? And maybe it's not the most fair, and that's totally fine at this point to kind of prioritize giving people new toys to play with, for lack of a better term, versus like worrying so much about the balancing thing, especially because there's not like such a dedicated like pro league that's like breaking things for everybody, like showing people like what are the most OP strategies and things like that. Because there's a little bit more freedom in that regard, it's easier for us to make some of these like really big changes that people might go, that's broken too. We kind of want that in a way, to reinvigorate people to play these characters that maybe they agree with that serve is clunky. Maybe they agree that Yu Huang is clunky, or any of these characters that have shown up on these lists over the past couple of patches. And really, another big like point that I want to hammer home is that we're not trying to force change for change's sake on every single character, because some characters just feel smooth right now. Like Susano is a character that I would kind of use as an example for this, where like he kind of does the things that you want him to do. He feels really smooth to play, and like maybe people would disagree. Maybe different people on different inputs, like controller players, would feel differently, and maybe there is something that we can do there to make those players have a better experience. But a lot of the stuff that we're looking at is like, what can we immediately do, or what can we do with the resources that we have, right? That we don't have to go to art for, that we don't have to go to animation for. And that list gets smaller and smaller over time. Unfortunately, that's just the nature of the beast. We can't keep picking the low-hanging fruit forever. So we have to do a little bit more planning to do the god changes versus just like regular balance. But even like some of the regular balance stuff that we did, like I said, the Maui change was something I did in 5 minutes. We were like, yeah, cool, let's do it. So we will continue to discover things like that, because we don't have perfect insight on how everything works, right? Like I sometimes have to go into a character that I have not touched in a while, or that I'm super unfamiliar with, and like figure out how they work and how they're constructed kind of in the database. And so sometimes that will reveal to me, like it did with Cerberus, like it did with Maui, what if we just change this and see what happens? Because again, there's just so many gods in the game, and each ability is set up differently. There's so many different variables that come into play that having perfect visibility on that is just not a realistic thing to have for every single designer in the business. It's just kind of a lot of information. So we will continue to make those discoveries, and we're not forcing things to change. I think we're only changing it if we feel like it's going to be fun and exciting and new, and really encourage people to try and play it more.
Yeah, and now's the perfect time to experiment. If there's any time,
exactly.
it's going to be now. Like you said, no pro league going on right now. So it's just a really good time to experiment in Smite 2, hopefully around the corner. Which is something I actually want to talk about as well. Do you find that it's a lot easier to develop in Unreal Engine 5 versus UE3?
It's hard. I'm still learning. I don't come from a background knowing a lot of computer science and programming and logic and things like that. It's slowly become easier over time. And I'm still, in my process of learning like what blueprints do and where everything's organized and where all of the pieces are located. So it's hard to say. It's definitely harder because there's a lot more responsibility, but also that includes like creativity and onus on designers to be able to make a lot of these things on their own. Because Blueprints is a visual programming language. Like, we have previously had to hand off tasks to programming that we can now do ourselves, which means that programming is now freed up to do a lot of other things, which is awesome and really, really cool. But it's also scary because I'm like, I'm not a programmer and I have to learn all of this stuff. And it sometimes feels like this Mount Everest almost, of like, I have to like get to this point to feel like I have the same impact that I do in Smite 2 as I do in Smite 1, which is a scary feeling for someone who has to do this for a job. It's a little bit of like, at least on a personal level, I'm like, oh snap, like I actually have to learn this, or like I'm gonna fall behind. Like that is a feeling that's very real. But I do know that a lot of the other designers are with me in that regard. So it's always nice to go to someone and be like, hey, do you know why this doesn't work? And they're like, yeah, I ran into that last week. Like, don't worry about it. Like, this is how you do it. Now you're good. So
That's what teams are
I will
for.
say, yeah, I will say it's scary, but it would be a whole lot more scary if I wasn't working with, some of my favorite people in the whole world. Like, I love my team so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I was going to ask too is, in terms of like the overall process for working in Smite 2, do you think there are developmental limitations that you guys had working with UE3 that UE5 kind of like fixes a bit?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit less on like my side of things and more so on the
Yeah.
artistic and sound and animation and all these other kind of more like art oriented versus like actual functionality in terms of like what the god does. I think there are possibilities to do a lot more things now, which I think is really cool, and it fixes a lot of the limitations with sounds and things like that, and just the way that things look and have to look in Smite 1. We just have a lot more freedom there, which is awesome. For me, I'm still learning, what that looks like in terms of my job, because I just don't have that full understanding at this point. So I could probably, have a little bit more detail on that, maybe in a couple months or a year. But like, there's just so much to learn at this point that I'm just going into it like breaking it down one step at a time and then like moving from there. So it's hard to say, at least on my behalf. Like maybe Pon would have a more like constructed answer in terms of like, oh yeah, like in Smite 1 we couldn't do that at all, and now I can just do this. But yeah, the general gist of things is that like I can actually make abilities on my own now, which is super sick. I don't have to ask programming for any of that stuff, which makes prototyping really, really fast, which is super, super cool. I'm trying to think of an example that doesn't break NDA. But essentially, like characters can get made and like ready to be prototyped and play tested in like a week now, which is crazy. Because that would take months and months and months before. I mean, a lot of it is that a lot of the heavy lifting is done in terms of making their kits, right? Because like for instance, we're not like putting a brand new soul into Smite 2. It's just like soul but with some bonuses. So that hard part is out. That like cuts out 3 months of work essentially. But to like know that that is like a peak that we can achieve, like that's the top of Mount Everest, is like when I get there I can do that. That's super, super cool and really, really encouraging to know that that's what's at the end of the line for me, is being able to do things like that and get really excited about being able to do that with new things and new characters as well.
So can we like sort of expect, I mean I know you don't you're probably not going to know like the direct answer to this, but can we sort of expect more frequent patches in the future for like Smite 2 because it's a bit more efficient for you guys to develop?
I don't know. I want to say no, just because Smite players are used to a certain cadence and there's a certain like diminishing returns on like how much change is too much change.
That's true.
So I would say I can't like answer 100%, right, because I'm not super in on that side, but like probably sticking within like the 2 to 4 week cycle will be pretty normal. And then when it comes to like the amount of gods, I also can't say, because sometimes they get held up in places that aren't like programming or design. They can get held up because maybe people aren't satisfied with their effects or their sounds or their animations, or it could be any number of things that would slow down that process. But it also might come from design too, because maybe we're waiting on programming for a certain new feature. Like if it was going to be, I'm just making stuff up at this point, but like if we were asking programming like, hey, where's that wall tech for Kleedna, and it's not done yet, like it's not going to be ready to go in. So it's going to be very different for every single character, because obviously 130 characters have a lot of really unique aspects to them. So we're slowly building those pieces of the puzzle and putting them together as they come in. So that timeline just looks different for every character, basically, of like how quickly they can get done. And like what also gets redone on them as well, because like certain characters have had remodels, like on her and Fenrir got like proportion changes that have really changed how they looked a lot. A lot of characters are getting extra art assets, which is really, really cool. So it's hard to say exactly what those timelines look like. It's going to be a very unique experience, is what I can say, at least.
Definitely. No, I fully understand that. So for for Smite 2, I feel like there's been a lot of, I mean, there's been a lot of positive press around it as well, but I feel like there has also been sort of like a lot of negative press, in the sense that um, after the second alpha released, a lot of players were saying like it's kind of boring to play. There isn't as much content in the game as people would like. Of course, it's just an alpha, and hopefully, we'll see more in the beta when the beta releases. What, July 30th, I believe.
Yeah, I don't know even if that date is sticking at this point. Everything's kind of up in the air. It's gonna depend, like you said, a lot on like community perception of like, are we ready for this? Like, do we have the content that people want and expect for that point? So yeah, I can't say specifically. That's just a date that we had to set for publishers because they require that, but that date can change. So who knows? We'll see.
Is there without, I mean, obviously, you can't like tell me everything what's going on because NDA and all that kind of stuff, but is there a lot of things in the works to maybe add more to the map itself? Or how is sort of like the development pipeline sort of like handling some of like the negative press around it, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I know that just in general, I've been getting more involved with that stuff. So slowly over time, we've been, making sure that there is more time to learn about Smite 2's processes and like kind of hone in on what those should look like compared to what they look like on Smite 1. So I know that the teams are definitely taking the feedback in stride and they want to keep making changes. It's just about finding the place to slot it into the schedule because the schedule is really tight right now. We came in with a plan, we came in swinging, and sometimes that plan's not going to hit. And that's just the reality of working in live service games, is that those things happen, especially when you're making a new game. It's something you have to build from the ground up. And it is something that we definitely are working on right now. I know that basically every team is continuing to adjust and balance and add new things. The pace of that is something that has yet to be determined because it's all about, how does it actually feel when we try it? How much time does it take to actually put it into the game? Does this require any art? Does it require sounds? And do they even have time in their schedule to fit those things in? When can we schedule those things for? Some things we have been planning for. This will be on the way. But that's just the reality of working in game dev, is we have all these amazing ideas and we have to work with the process versus try and fight it and shove a million things into the patch. So it all comes with time and with some solid planning. So hopefully we will deliver on that. In terms of the timeline, I really can't speak to that at this point because it's just so complicated in terms of what goes where and how much time this takes and what has availability and what can be pushed back, because obviously if our schedule is full now, something's got to move in order for things to get fixed up, and we can account to have some of that time, but obviously there wasn't enough time accounted for that. So it is an ever-changing process that we're working through at this point.
This is why I like also too, like things like this where I'm able to talk with you about this, because I think a lot of people just end up getting lost in the fact that it's like, I want this change now, I demand this now, and you just don't think about everything that has to go through it, all the bureaucracy, all the
Yeah.
different people working on it. So no, I definitely really respect this. I think it kind of sheds a lot of light on the issues.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you write a lot of voice packs, right?
Yes, I love writing voice packs, dude. It's so
what's your
fun.
what's your favorite voice line in Smite?
My favorite voice line. Oh
Yeah.
gosh, there's so many. I really like writing the esports skins because I get to do a lot of like the cringy like esports humor. So there was one voice pack, I think it was for the Hera esports skin, where she makes a line about some of the casters and it's like, who's the one guy that sells chairs? And I showed that to Dulcin and he like freaked out. He was like, there's no way that you like referenced me in a Smite voice pack. And being able to do like small things like that and like making references to like community memes or just like general like kind of meta humor jokes is so much fun. I love doing things like that. I also like writing the really edgy voice packs just because they get to be really extreme and like put you in like a really fun headspace to be like, what would this like destroyer of worlds like cold-blooded killer like actually like vibe with? Or like some of the more cute ones too are really fun. It's like what is like cute but like not too annoying. Like it's just kind of fun playing these different characters and like seeing like what they would sound like. That's just like more of like a narrative design kind of angle. That is really fun to like sit in these characters' shoes and like look at a concept and be like, what does that sound like? It's a really interesting place to be in, especially when the actor then comes in and performs it, which is another aspect of it. Like I can sit in, and for new gods as well, dude. Let me tell you, when I have sat in on these voice sessions, they tend to be towards the end of the process, like maybe 2.5 months, like before we're done. Like sitting in for Newt with the lore lady, like I was having like a fangirl moment. I'm like losing my mind. It was so cool to be able to like it felt like an honor for me to write the voice pack for the lore lady's actual character in Smite, and I was like living my like childhood dream of like I heard her. I was like, I heard her. She's like the lady from all the videos, and I was talking to her, and like my mind was blown. Like being able to have that experience and like meet the people behind these really iconic voices is super cool, and like write for them as well. Like I feel bad for some of the like voice actors that I've written lines for. One that I can think of is I wrote the Cthulhu voice pack, and I handed the script off to the actor, and I said, "There you go, man. Enjoy Cthulhu." Some of the like I guess like differences in performance, like you can look up some of these actors and they'll have like the most serious skin ever, and then it'll be like Kawaii Pop Bastet as like on the other side of it. And it's so funny to see the differences in like the range of their voice as well. Just like working with all of these people is such a different thing compared to like the rest of the stuff that I do. It's like a nice breath of fresh air to kind of like, again, play these characters. Like what would they say? What would they do? What kind of like micro stories can I tell in this voice pack? Which is another really cool, fun thing, is like adding little like lore tidbits in there, like funny like meta humor. Again, it's like something that I really like doing. So it's just a really different experience than everything else that I do, and it's so much fun.
Definitely. And I feel like Lore Lady has like one of the just the best voices. I mean, there's a reason why I
She's
use her
just
voice back
iconic.
all the time. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
100%. 100%. Where do you get the inspiration to write some of the voice lines that you do? They just coming up
It's really
naturally,
tough.
or?
Yeah, again, it's kind of like putting on like the character. Like sometimes when I'm writing a voice pack, like I'll say the lines myself, which like maybe is like a little bit like a dorky thing to do, but like it gets you in the vibe of like, who is this character? What kind of things would they say? What kind of things would they do? And sometimes like if you get into that like mindset of like, this guy's really edgy and he like wants to destroy people, like what would he say like in a situation where like he has to kill a tower? What does that sound like? Because like every like there's a set number of lines that you put into the game, right? And like they are showing up for different things, like if you're using your abilities, if you're on a kill streak. Announcer packs too is another one that I write. So it's like, if I'm this character and this happens to me, what am I doing? And it kind of goes into that like sort of acting like style where like I'm playing these characters and like, what are they saying? I guess I've said that kind of a lot, but like it's just such a fun experience, and there's such a variety of characters that I've written for too. I think at this point I've got to have written like close to 150 voice packs.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
and just like the wide variety of them, like going from just a very simple example, writing for Yu Huang and writing for Ishtar is like two completely different experiences, where one is like this really cool, calm, collected, very like enlightened guy, and the other one's like, I'm just gonna kill everything in front of me, like let's fight. It's very very interesting to go through like those back and forths, and like usually I'm working on like 2 to 3 of them for each patch, and so I like to kind of pick ones that are very different so I can have those different experiences, and not have to find the 50th way to make some like super like scary guy say oops. Like how many different ways can you say oops, really? It's like one of the things that comes up a lot.
Oh, 100%. Some of the voice lines are actually just so funny.
Mhm.
Oh, man, I'm trying to think of one. In certain scenarios too. I think like Aries has a few funny ones. I think the keep it up one where he's like, nice job. I don't know why, but like whenever you like spam that whenever somebody dies, like friend dies, friendly, all friendly
Yeah.
BM, friendly BM. But it's just like, it's just too funny. It just all depends on context.
Yeah, it's been very interesting to see. We've had like Mifflin and Gormizer and Ro start to come in and write voice packs as well, and watching them like start to learn like the different like aspects of writing voice packs and like see what their style is, because I feel like I have a very specific style where like, again, I really like writing the edgy characters. I like writing the meta humor characters. And they really had a lot of fun writing the kind of like jokey characters, or the like more serious like I know Ro's written a couple of like more like just chill guys, and I'm like, that makes sense for Ro. Ro's a very chill guy, it all makes sense. But it's been really cool to see them develop as writers too, because again, it's very different to everything else that we do, but it's just another like fun piece of the chain that is like, it comes to us because we know the character is probably the best in terms of personality out of most of the departments in the game.
So one thing you mentioned earlier was that like way towards the beginning is that you have kind of sat in on some of the esports
Mm-hmm.
like ideas and whatnot. What's like one of the craziest ideas that you heard that probably didn't get let through, if you can tell me, that is that you heard for like the SPL?
Well, not specifically like in the SPL. I don't get to do most of the like structured decision around like what the pro league does, but like when they come in and they offer like me, like I can remember for the Martichoras brainstorm that we had with Esports, they find bits to do in the different meetings. So sometimes it devolves a bit into a bit of chaos, but that's like part of the fun, right? So Mifflin comes in and he's like, "This guy's a lion, right?" And I'm like, "Yeah, he's like a lion monster dude. Yeah, you're like on the point." So what he goes, "So what if we have this ability and it's called Melodious Roar?" And he just keeps saying different things, but he's always like, "All right, here's an ability, Melodious Roar." And I'm like, "You just said that." And that's the bit. That's the bit, right? Is he keeps saying the same thing, but they do different things. The next meeting that I had was for Charon. And that one was where Dolson was on a bit where he was like, "All right, so they're boys and they're in a boat. The boys are in the boat." And I'm like, "Okay, what does that mean? What does he do when the boys are in the boat?" He's like, "The boys are in the boat." And that's all he says. And so some of these, they are definitely more productive than that, but I just really enjoy the just silly little bits because it does actually lend like itself to kind of tell me what players expect the characters to do. So even if they don't give me an idea that I can use, if they say, the lion should roar or the boat guy should boat, that will tell me what players will expect them to do kind of in a general sense. And then I can use that information. So it's just some silly things like that. When it comes to like what they pitch to me, sometimes there have been really good ideas. I know there's like kind of a meme that goes around that like about Scotty Ice. Like people go, "Oh yeah, F-Dot pitched that," or "Oh yeah, Hindeman pitched that," and like it's not really any of that. Like when it comes to the actual like final kit decision, that comes a lot from the designers. But it is really funny when either of them get crap on Twitter for it. I laugh at that a little bit. But it's all in good fun. It's all in memes.
Yeah, of course.
I just really appreciate people that come in and just know like how to have fun with those kind of brainstorming sessions, because a lot of the times it can be hard for people to kind of come to those meetings prepared with like ideas, just because some departments are better at that than others just in general, whether they are not necessarily like the biggest Smite players ever. Like it's good to have a wide variety of those people that are newer players, very skilled players, but sometimes they'll come in and say very general things, or like I'll have to take their ideas and reshape them to work in Smite because they play more fighting games or they play single player games or platformers or anything like that, and they try to take ideas from that and just put them in Smite wholesale, and sometimes that just doesn't work. So trying to like narrow down the gist of their idea and make it like Smitify it is sometimes like what I have to do to get things to like really start moving in those brainstorms, and then they get really excited, which is awesome. But it's usually got to break the ice in those meetings. And then once we do, then it gets rolling, and it's a lot of fun to just come up with really crazy ideas. And I keep telling them like their job in these meetings is not to give me things that are going to work in Smite. Their job is to tell me what they expect this character would do. Like what would a skeletal boat guy do? What would this stellar goddess of the sky do? What would this giant manticore monster do? Not so much like what is something that we have to worry about when it comes to limitations. Like, can animation even do that? Like, I don't care about that stuff at that point. I just want them to get excited and tell me their expectations and what is really cool. So that part, I think Esports does really, really well, because they just like hone in on the like what is really cool part, and that has come up quite a lot.
Definitely. And you got me with the term Smitify. I might have to
Yeah.
I might have to use that in the future. So was game development always something that you wanted to do growing up? Was it sort of like a dream of yours, or was it something that you just sort of stumbled into?
It's interesting. I have always liked playing games. I got a lot of inspiration from my dad because he was a big gamer throughout his life. So I would watch him play, and he would encourage me to try things. And I think the first ever game that I really played, I like to tell the story a lot because I think I look back at myself and I'm like, oh my god, I would have been so mad about this. But he was playing Pokemon Leaf Green on a Game Boy. And there was one day where I was like, I saw my dad playing this and I was so excited about it because I always watched him play it. And so I took the Game Boy and I started my own game. And as you know, those things have one save file, and I deleted his save to make my own. And if that was me, I would have been so mad. But my dad was more excited than I've ever seen him to see me actually want to go and play that. So that like whole experience was kind of like the gist of like me growing up. My dad was always very excited about it. My mom, not so much, but that's okay. She can deal with it. But essentially I always knew that I loved games. Game development is really, really difficult, so I was very much more leaning into the art side of things growing up. I was very interested in art, but it's been something that is a lot more competitive in the industry to get into. And it's also just a little bit more, I guess, for me specifically, I wasn't so into art that I was like, this is the only thing I want to do forever. I was more of the like kind of person that wanted to explore different aspects. And that makes it really, really difficult to get into art because it's just so competitive. So essentially, in college, I went into a lot of different like aspects of tech and just like kind of did more of a like general education, I guess, between like a bunch of different tech. Like I did do some programming, but I also did some animation. I did some graphic design, I did some web design. Like there's a bunch of different things that I did in college, but nothing like specifically centered on game development. It kind of happened by accident, I won't lie. I was playing Smite for like 5 years at that point. By the time that I was getting up to the like I'm graduating college, and I had been involved in just the esports scene a little bit through like casting. I did a very small like minor amount of coaching, like it wasn't anything too crazy, but like I was really involved in the community because it was a lot of fun. So I knew that I always wanted to move to Atlanta just to be around the Smite. That was like my general vibe. Was I just love Smite so much, I want to be near it. Like a lot of my friends live here. Even before, like I met a lot of people through work. Like there were just people that were in this area that I really wanted to spend time with. So I wasn't even looking at a job at Hi-Rez initially because I was like, I can't do any of this. I don't know what any of this means. But eventually, my dad actually showed me the first job that I ever got at Hi-Rez, which was in quality assurance. And I went into that job not knowing a single thing about quality assurance. But it was essentially that job is a lot of like checking to make sure that, if bugs are happening, why does that bug happen? How can I send this to the right team? Things like that. And those were things that I was already doing. And I had connections at that point through esports, so they generally like knew of me because I had been doing contract work and I was interested in being a caster at that point. But it all kind of was a happy little accident that happened. So I spent like a year doing QA. I moved to Georgia. It was a really awesome experience. I have loved, every single moment of being in the place where I'm at right now. And then I'm approached by Ajax and he's like, how would you like to be on the design team? And I'm like, I'm sorry, what? I didn't even think about that. Like, I was chilling QA, like I was loving my job, and then he was just like giving me the golden ticket essentially, like, do you want to have even more like influence on what the game looks like? Like it's obvious that you care a lot about the game and you really want it to succeed. Like you've shown that even through the extra stuff that you do in QA and participation in playtests and things like that. Like I'm just like a humongous Smite super fan at the end of the day. So having that experience and like kind of chance of a lifetime, I guess you could say, come up like multiple times is just like insane. Like I'm eternally grateful every single day that I can still do this as my job. I get paid for this. I can make a living off of this. Like that's insane to me. Like if I told myself that when I was playing in the room next to my parents where they were sleeping at 3 a.m. and I'm still there playing Smite until like the absolute beginning of the morning, yeah, I don't know if I would believe myself at that point, but it's been a wild journey to this point, and it's really like incredible that it even happened. But, like generally people are like, what kind of education did you get? What kind of like things did you do to get into this field? And honestly, it was a lot of learning on the job. The reason that I'm as good as at my job as I am is I was really, really passionate about Smite and I knew a lot about Smite. And that can be true of a lot of different games as well. For people that are really interested in game development, like my biggest piece of advice is get out there and make ideas. Get excited about stuff and be passionate about making not necessarily content, but just ideas and theory crafts and any of those things. And that will show even if you don't have any professional training, which I didn't really have all that much. A lot of people think that you have to be like 100% ready to do your job as soon as you apply for it. That's just not true. In almost any field, they are anticipating that you're going to need some amount of training. And I sure did get quite a lot of training going into this job. Even the QA job that I had some training that I had to do to make sure that everything was going in the right direction. But it is just an experience that I hope that everyone gets to have in their lives, where they get to have a job that they are as excited to go to work every day that I am. Or as I am. English is hard.
No, you're good. Yeah, I mean, listen, just talking with you today, You ooze passion for Smite, definitely. Like it's all over the place, for lack of a better term. But I mean, I can obviously clearly see that you're very, very passionate about the game, and it's awesome to have a developer such as yourself working at Hi-Rez and developing the game that we all know and love. So we're definitely internally grateful for that.
Yeah, I mean, thank you guys. I mean, for real, like my job would not exist if people didn't keep playing Smite. So I'm just happy that there are people excited to log on and excited to do things.
Yeah, and hopefully another, at the very least, many, many years to Smite 2 as well. What
Yes, I hope
advice
so.
would you Yeah, definitely. What advice would you give to someone trying to get into game development? I know that
Yeah.
you kind of touched upon that just now a little bit, but is there anything else that you could sort of like say to people, or that you think that people should know if they're trying to get into game development?
I guess do some amount of research into like what the game development pipeline looks like, because it was a really big shock to me. Like I will say, before I became a developer and I didn't understand any of the pipeline or the process or the publishing, like any of those extra bits of effort, like it is such an eye opener. Like I can't even explain to you how much my perspective changed going from the outside to seeing what happens on the inside and understanding a little bit more. Like I do think that, and this is just a fact of life, this is never going to change. Some people have the perspective that the developers of really any game, this could be any game, don't know what they're doing. They took too long. They didn't action on feedback. And it's just, frankly, almost certainly not true. The amount of passion and care and change that developers do all the time, and this is just, from experience and witnessing other, topics and events that come up in the gaming sphere. These are things that people action on all the time. They're just not the easiest to change immediately. And it's a little saddening in some regards to see just how harsh the people can be on game developers. So educating people on what that experience looks like is really, really important to me, because it helps everyone give more helpful and insightful feedback and criticism that is going to help to bolster games versus detract from them. And just being more understanding of what the limitations look like in game development. I mean, this is people's jobs and people's lives, right? We can't just make them work 80-hour work weeks and be like, yeah, with me, the content comes first. It does not come first, frankly. I mean, these are all people at the end of the day, right? So we have to make sure that everyone is doing what they are capable of, what's healthy for them, and just being more compassionate about those things is something that I'm really passionate about, because it affects the people that I work with just as much as it affects me. I may be a person that's on the front lines, right, of receiving a lot of that criticism and feedback, but it does affect the people behind the scenes as well, when people will say, kind of uncalled for things. But that's the internet, right? I'm not saying that has to go away completely, but just even an ounce more compassion for the developers. I mean, because we're on the same team. Everyone wants Smite to be fun. I lose my job if Smite's not fun. So that's not something that I want by any means, and that's not something that any of the other developers want either. At the end of the day, we all want Smite to be as fun as it can be, and I'm sure that's true for every other game developer out there. So learning more about that, process, like I said, is super, super important when it comes to just having some perspective and compassion for what that process looks like. Because you can be as much of a go-getter as you want to be. Like I do see myself in that regard. As I want to get things done. I want to make a lot of change, but it has to be reasonable, right? We have to be using our resources and managing that. And that was like the biggest thing that came as like a culture shock almost, was like, they know about all of these things. Like I came into QA, I was like, oh my God, I'm going to tell them all these bugs. I'm going to show them all these things that are broken with the game, and then they're going to fix them. And it was like, no, we already know about those things. We just have to triage them essentially. And I'm like, wait, you knew about all these things and you didn't fix them? And then it's not even like that, because then it becomes, well, we have to, do the most important things first, and we have to do X, Y, Z. And if this affects our bottom line, that's probably more important than something that, looks or feels bad, things of that nature. And it's a difficult, difficult job. I'm not going to lie. There are so many pieces that go into games that I'm surprised that so many games get made. But at the end of the day, everyone that works on games does it for a love of just playing games at the end of the day. And yeah, I think learning about this process is just so insightful as to what the job actually entails. Like I don't get to go and like just play Smite for 8 hours every day. Like I have to have conversations with so many different people and plan things months in advance. And it is a job. Even though it's a really fun job, it is still a job at the end of the day. So yeah, just I think the biggest piece of advice that I could give, other than just like making things and being excited about things, is learning about the process of actually making a game. And what better way to do it than making something yourself?
Yeah,
It
that's
all
very
comes
true.
together.
Wise words from Lermy. Wise words. Well, thank you so much for being on today's podcast. I really appreciate it. And honestly, this conversation has, at the very least, given me a newfound appreciation for all the work and time that gets put into the game that we play. And I know for other people that listen to this as well, it'll probably be the same exact thing for them too. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. And thanks for having me. I just love talking about Smite. So any chance I get to do that, like, it's cool by me.